Good day or night, everyone. Welcome to Mandala. We have a very special, exciting program for everyone today, and it'll be a very special edition for no other reason than we're joined by one of my favorite artists going right now, Ketamine Kong. How are you today, sir?
Oh, Ketamine Kong is me. Man, I'm not too bad. I'm just a bit spaced out from last night's cocaine use, but other than that, yeah, Ketamine Kong's doing alright.
It's interesting, you're doing the unexpected. People, assume from your name that you indulge in just the one drug, but you enter a variety of different substances that the law doesn't want you to take.
Just cocaine and cough medicine.
Well, everyone has their vices, including myself, as you can tell. Hopefully you can tolerate this particular vocoder effect. Anyway, I'd like to introduce a certain theme which I was kind of hinting at the last week. There's a certain pop-tomistic tendency for Mandala thus far. I've been interested in this sort of art pop, what I described as the dual sensation of appreciating the sonic palette of what you're listening to, plus letting it move your body around, letting yourself give in to the sensations, celebrating the lack of conscious free will, as some propose about our human consciousness.
I think that might conform to all my choices, yeah.
Well, that's fantastic.
Damn, there you go.
Because I'm taking a slightly different, more rockist bend for my choices in this program. They're albums which I got into them, all these groups at least, mostly, during my younger formative adolescent years, and I was interested in them because, you listen to them, you go on adventures, and it's not like you pull tracks from these albums to listen to individually, but you like the LP experience in the very 70s suburban bedroom manner. And why don't we start with the ultimate of the 70s bedroom albums. Ladies and gentlemen, well, let's introduce this band, Queen. I feel as though, Queen doesn't need an introduction. However, when it comes to these exalted LPs, you ever look at lists of the greatest albums of all time by the likes of Rolling Stone magazine, say, you'll see a Beatles album near the top of the list, Sgt. Pepper's
Always,
perhaps.
yeah.
Led Zeppelin 4, The Who, Who's Next, or Tommy, David Bowie, Ziggy Stardust, Bob Dylan, Highway 61 Revisited, Rolling Stones, Let It Bleed, or Exile on Main Street perhaps, Black Sabbath, Paranoid even.
Yeah,
Where's the Queen album that's listed there? Now, normally people cite Night at the Opera might be the closest thing, but the fact is, it's not really that exalted. Maybe now Queen are more popular than ever because of the film from 2018 or so, and so now people are saying, oh, well, Night at the Opera is as good as these ones. It's a great release. I never thought it was quite up to the scratch for the albums we were mentioning. Maybe I'm not the biggest Bob Dylan fan in the world, so I'm going to throw Highway 61 Revisited out there. And as far as the Stones go, actually more of an Exile guy than a Let It Bleed guy. I mean, Let It Bleed's okay, but Exile's the one that is that good compared to the other ones there, I think. But that we mentioned. But that others mentioned. But, Night at the Opera was a very conscious, deliberate attempt at this sort of regal LP effort, and it reeks of that sort of art rock which punk wanted to rebel against later. It reminds you of 10cc and ELO, perhaps better than, well, at least ELO. 10cc were pretty good. And
when they're wacky, they're pretty good.
Exactly. Yeah. And there's something about Night at the Opera which does feel, as impressive as it is, a bit contrived. And I actually I really love Queen too, and I love Sheer Heart Attack as well. Night at the Opera I don't visit as much as those two. I'm not the biggest Queen 1 fan. It's alright. I know Martin Popoff adores it. It's a bit arena rock for me, a bit pomp rock for me. And so, but, moving on from Night at the Opera, any true Queen fan knows that there was an exalted masterpiece released amongst the discography which matched the likes of the greatest LPs from the artists, the aforementioned legacy rock artists. And true Queen fans know, true music fans know, that that album is, of course, A Day at the Races. However, I always felt as though the sequel to A Day at the Races, though it was less Regal Roxy music, and by Regal Roxy music I mean Day at the Races really just decided to play with a different genre each track. It's a real art rock album, very emblematic, very deliberate, everything the punk rockers sought to want to destroy. But that being said,
destroy.
Exactly. An album which was recorded in the same studio as News of the World concurrently, but we'll get to that in a moment. A Day at the Races was the masterpiece of the Queen albums. And News of the World was considered a departure at the time, although I thoroughly see it as the sibling to Day at the Races. As much as Day at the Races was considered the sequel to Night at the Opera, News of the World is thoroughly... there's a continuity there, I feel, quite consciously, because despite News of the World having the reputation of being the arena rock album, the one that went transatlantic, the one that really broke through in America, that 1-2 punch, that's the most iconic or well-known 1-2 punch in LP rock history. We Will Rock You, We're the Champions, it's played to this day, done to death, we all know that, cliche to the point of banality.
Yeah, sports anthem classic.
Exactly, and We Are the Champions, probably considered in Freddie's mind like some UK football anthem. Now it's like a gridiron or ice hockey classic. You know what I mean?
Sure.
America it was used infamously in the Miracle on Ice event in the 80s, right?
Oh, okay.
I think you told me that.
Yeah, I must have read it once and just it slipped my mind. But that makes a lot of sense.
You know, but that being said, other than that, like, it's a huge wealth of variety on News of the World. It's not like this, they just went in straight into AC/DC or even into Who's Next. This is the track Sheer Heart Attack is very heavy, but it is almost their weird punk rock statement, even though it shares the title of the third album, Sheer Heart Attack, which makes you think it was written in the glam rock era and then punkified in 77. All Dead is completely different. It's like, it's very somber, depressing Brian May track, which is apparently, the story goes, is about the passing of his cat when he was young. And this weird ballad in Spread Your Wings, which is a really weak point on the album. It reminds me too much of a Journey song. It's maybe telling that the co-producer on here is Mike Stone, who went on to produce the Journey records.
Okay.
And side B's, well, actually no, there's what's it called? Five from the Inside concludes side 1, and that's a Roger Taylor sung sort of almost Rod Stewart-esque. That's more of a hard rocker. I mean, side B's all over the place. Get Down, Make Love is one of their heaviest songs, but it's almost like something Frank Zappa would have composed during this period, and not one lyric would be changed.
No, that's true. Similar, yeah.
Sleeping on the Sidewalk it's like what Martin Popoff would call, what's he call it? Queen doing novelty? Or where it's like this kind of quaint little homagey, satirical, like, 20s, 30s blues number.
Yeah, it's an old-timey blues number, and it's about the record industry.
Mm-hmm.
That song actually has a fascinating little, like, theme running through
Absolutely.
it, I feel.
That's good stuff.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Who Needs You is like a Latin bossa number. That's quite pretty. John Deacon, the bassist, composed that. Sung by Freddie, though, of course.
Yeah.
It's Late is the real kind of arena epic. Not unlike the standard things they were doing, Bohemian Rhapsody, March of the Black Queen, there's segments, it builds up, crescendos. My Melancholy Blues, Freddie doing this vocal jazz blues thing, it's a perfect, beautiful little thing. Everyone who goes on about how great a singer Freddie is, I don't think this one's cited enough by those people. Stop being cliche, get this one in there, as well as Cool Cat from Hot Space. But, that's a bit sacrilege for some of the old school fans. The point is, I've always felt as though, other than Day at the Races, and I do love Queen too, News of the World is the most fascinating and art rocky, despite having that 1-2 punch at the start there. That's kind of part of the package, I feel. Day at the Races started with an arena rock number, essentially, and Tie Your Mother Down, so we shouldn't be too fooled by this, or at least see it as too much of a departure. To me, a hard rock album is like what? Like Highway to Hell comes out around this time. That's a hard rock album. This is still that kind of regal, kind of pretentious art rock territory that I really appreciate. But that's just the album in a vacuum. I also find the album uber fascinating culturally. That's why it was the first ever Cosmic Criticism over a year ago now, because I found it so fascinating that, look, this is the album that Homer Simpson would have been staying up drinking Duff beers at an age younger than he should have been, in the late 70s, when he was 17. And you can imagine Hank Hill and his friends driving around listening to this on cassette.
Sure,
This is like that ultimate, like, kind of weird, like, male romance chivalry thing that was bizarrely popular amongst, younger men at that time. I mean, The Who had these rock operas, which are considered very, very cool at one point. And it's amazing to me that, at one time, these very operatic, melodramatic, balladesque, kind of... Well, Freddie Mercury once said, infamously, he wanted to bring Which Annoyed Some Punks, and Paul Weller specifically, bring ballet to the masses. But I think he did, because they were an enormously successful band across both sides of the pond. So it worked. I mean, whether you like it or not, I mean, this is like the most remembered rock group of the 70s, except for maybe Fleetwood Mac.
Yeah, there are a few others, but they're in the upper echelon, you'd say.
Well, it's interesting now that Queen are like the most well-known rock group, seemingly. More, they've passed the test of time more than Zeppelin. I like Zeppelin a lot. That's not a dig or anything.
Yeah,
The Who.
They remained a little more relevant than Zeppelin and the Who in like the 2010s and beyond because of that movie. Maybe the good, the Who, they were fairly popular, just as like a sort of classic rock staple,
of course,
through the 2000s. But yeah, maybe they have sort of eclipsed Led Zeppelin a little bit in the popular culture.
But you know what it is? It's how iconic and catchy those songs are in that Beatles sense. You know, We Are the Champions.
Yeah.
Bohemian Rhapsody, Killer Queen, Don't Stop Me Now, and even stuff like Another One Bites the Dust, which is kind of less interesting to me. But, you know, these songs, Trace a Little Thing Called Love as well, they transcend across time, and people get into them forever, like they're those old Fleetwood Mac songs. Even the kind of crappy stuff Queen put out during the 80s, like the actual crap, like The Works, you know, I Want to Break Free, Radio Gaga. Yeah. That stuff's crap. That stuff actually crap. I love Hot Space, but the stuff afterward, Until Innuendo.
I guess those songs go
sucks.
into, like, Starship territory.
Yeah, hey.
That sort of 80s thing, yeah.
It's rubbish. And I've always been very fond of Queen because they're actually the first rock band I really got into. I had a friend in year one who was telling me about this song he was learning on guitar, Real Rock You, singing it to me, and I was like, well, this is a violent song.
Oh,
in your face, a big disgrace. I was like, woof. This is rough.
You're a big man in the street trying to be a big man, whatever it is. Yeah, it's sort of like...
Kicking a can all over the place.
It's the sort of song you picture, the lyrics, you picture Henry Rollins screaming at you in a 90s MTV music video.
Yes. It's amazing, but I thought this was such a hard song at the time. And then, you know, I got into We Are the Champions as well as... We were playing the greatest hits in the car. You know, once my mum realised I was into this band that she liked, it was an excuse to play their music in the car all the time.
Sure.
And to me...
Yeah, they had a greatest hits CD in the 2000s. It was like, yeah, everyone had it in their cars. That's true.
I think it may have been a reissue of the 1980 greatest hits on LP, which everyone had then.
Okay.
Like that's like the best-selling album, one of the best-selling albums ever.
Yeah,
maybe even their best-selling album. But you know, I slightly digress. There's, you know, they were just this huge, enormous kind of perpetual force, even after their disbandment, or at least Freddie Mercury's passing, you know, through the 2000s. And I just think it's a strength of... I don't think their albums are necessarily as strong as a couple times, maybe. You know, we mentioned The Who, Zeppelin, even Sabbath or Deep Purple, Beatles, Stones, Bowie. That might be true, and I can understand why they don't get as the same adoration, because sometimes they're not as consistent in terms of the track listings on these LPs, but sometimes the songs are genuinely, like, some of the best... I consider specifically, although the LP itself, Jazz, is underwhelming, Don't Stop Me Now and also Bicycle Race, those are the band's two best songs almost to me. Those songs, especially Don't Stop Me Now, I've never gotten tired of it since year one.
Album?
Yeah,
okay.
Jazz is 78. I've always found Jazz a bit underwhelming, sadly. That is the popular consensus. Some consider it underrated. I'm not in that camp, unfortunately. The Game afterward, the Game I'm not a big fan of either. But I'd play the Game is terrific. The second track, Dragon Attack, awesome stuff. The rest of it, I could do without. I get the appeal of Another One Bites the Dust and Crazy Little Thing Called Love. I liked them as a kid, but I just find them a bit corny and simplistic now, which is rather sad. The point, I guess at the end of the day, I just find them, they're a group of not a huge amount of like kind of music snob credibility, but they did have some seriously interesting work in their time, and they're such a formative, huge band on me. I can never ignore them. I can never truly look past them. And the more I look at them, I realize there is no reason to. The LPs from, let's say, 74 to 77 are all absolutely stellar, I think. I don't like the Next Stellar LP so much, but I'm a big fan of Hot Space. Love Hot Space. I dig it a lot. Cool Cat, as I said, one of the best things they ever put out. I don't like the next few ones. The Works, I love Highlander, but I don't like A Kind of Magic all that much. Although, can't go wrong with Princes of the Universe. Who Wants to Live Forever? That's a nice ballad from Freddie there. But, and then The Miracles are just awful. But Innuendo was a great return to form, kind of a deliberate attempt. You know, I guess he knows he's passing on at this point, very, very tragically. So they want to compose a real return to form akin to Night at the Opera, Day at the Races. And Innuendo, it's pretty kick-ass. I'm on board with Innuendo. I mean, I've always had a soft spot for the band, and I always felt as though I think News of the World was maybe a bit brushed aside as like kind of the pristine art rock era of Queen because it had those first two tracks on it. But
Yeah.
other than that, like it's the same old group. It's almost, you could almost accuse them of failing to live up to the punk revolution. Although they make some winks at it, it's not substantial, frankly.
No.
And I don't see them as dumbing down their sound really much whatsoever. The variety of A Day at the Races is still there, and there is some heavier tracks, but they're more either kooky and bizarre, like Get Down, Make Love, or sort of operatic and daring in a... They're not so bluesy, they're more symphonic, like It's Late.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. And then, of course, again, I can't praise My Melancholy Blues enough. I think that's a gorgeous set of lyrics, very impeccably and compellingly delivered by Mercury. I just think it's a really, really fascinating record, which I think what isn't received as classic status necessarily, like maybe the couple other Queen albums are in the Rolling Stone magazine or whatever the fuck world. I don't know, but
the rockist world.
Yeah, the rockist world. There you go. But I think it thoroughly deserved it. It wasn't just like the mainstream sort of we're not as interesting or like album centric now. It's like this group was like LP. The Game's the first one where it comes across as like some singles and some throwaway stuff on there. But I think this was meant to be taken seriously as a you play it from start to finish experiment. They took the LP as an art form very seriously. In that way, it wasn't... how punk was not dismissive of the LP, but like... it was more about that punchy set of songs rather than, this pretentious post-Dark Side of the Moon experience, you know what I mean?
And it was more about live shows.
Good point,
like,
yeah.
They took a while to start cutting their songs onto record, and it was mostly just done independently, and, the only band that, from the outset, that was really into, like, trying to put out an album is the Sex Pistols, right? Never mind the Bollocks. And that does conform to the sort of album as a sort of, pop art phenomenon.
Yeah.
Very much so. Like, that's kind of the aim of it.
Yeah.
Unlike, I don't know, most other punk bands from around that time, like the Damned or the Clash, they're mostly just cutting their songs on the first albums onto a record.
Yeah.
And doing it, they'd been around for quite a while prior to that, I think it was all about the live shows mostly. Yeah. Whereas Queen is, I'm sure they did put on massive arena shows.
Oh, yeah.
This album has a clear... sort of ethic for production, it's trying to get a sort of very clean sound, and I think the opening track is sort of, they said it was like a sort of conscious aim at like a radio arena sort of rock, radio song, and it's pretty effective for doing that. And then We Are the Champions is like for a ballad, it's surprisingly popular, and it's good that it works in the way that like the songs that would come later from bands like Foreigner and all those other, what you think of as like popular American radio ballad songs, like this is a proper song in comparison.
Yeah,
I suppose. And so, and at this point in time, I don't feel it's too overplayed that I can't not enjoy it, especially listening to it whilst listening to the album. I wouldn't really, I suppose, go out of my way to just listen to the song on its own.
Yeah.
But in conjunction with the album, it is enjoyable, and I guess I should just preface, like, I've never been the biggest Queen fan, because like I was describing all these people I knew who had that CD, and exactly like your experience there, that just wasn't the same experience that I had.
Yeah.
So Queen weren't that like hallmark band in my consumption of music, I suppose, and so I've never had like that sort of visceral attachment to Queen. But I do enjoy listening to some of their albums when I hear them. And especially like this one because you bought the LP.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to chuck on the LP and give this album a listen, especially for the sonics of its day.
Oh, yeah.
It's very spacious and interesting to hear. And listening to it just recently, I was sort of amazed at the, because when I first heard the album, I guess I thought it was a bit sporadic in its, say, track listing, because of what you were talking about before, the sort of variety of genres and stuff like that. But listening to it this time, the sequencing of Sheer Heart Attack into All Dead, I was like, wow, this is amazing.
Yeah,
that's a genius, like, bit of tone change,
It's bold.
Yeah, it's bold, and it suits, I think, lyrically the themes of both songs and musically in a very sort of fitting way. And then afterwards, you're just like, wow. And then that's...
Spread Your Wings.
Spread Your Wings kicks in, and it changes the tone a little bit. Like you said, songs like that, or maybe, I forget the name of it, but you said you compared it to like a sort of Rod Stewart hard rocker.
Oh, that's on Fire from the Inside.
Those are maybe why people sort of call this the dumbing down quotation marks album,
Yeah.
you know. But, those songs aren't great, but moments of them are really nice. Like,
I quite like Fire from the Inside, actually, like, at least musically.
Sure, yeah.
instrumental.
Oh, and some of the biggest, I suppose, like, cheese moments on the album are to do with the singing and stuff not fitting, or being a bit, like, going for that AOR audience, or, like, arena audience. Maybe that's why they get ignored a bit by, like, the music snobs.
Probably,
and stuff.
yeah.
But, like, as far as the... Maybe I understood the narrative of them dumbing it down, or at least, like, ripping it back to essentials and trying to do their own version of 70s hard rock guitar work.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm listening to it, and I'm not normally the biggest fan of that style of guitar, but I guess it's Brian May, right?
Yep.
He does it in such a tasteful and interesting way. It reminds me of how someone, I read on a YouTube comment once, described the guitar work on Monster by R.E.M. As like this very like tasteful 90s alternative guitar rock style. And I was like, wow, this is like in a way kind of them at the same phase of their career as R.E.M. with Monster, right? And they're sort of adapting to, you know, a more commercial friendly or like sound of its era sort of style. But he can, I guess he's such a creative guitar player, he can extrapolate a unique take on that style, which I can appreciate quite a lot.
Yeah, it's telling that one of his major influences, I think I've read, was Steve Hackett.
Yeah, that's telling, actually. Yeah, it does sound a bit like Steve Hackett. Or at least he's incorporating Steve Hackett-isms into, like, the typical 70s hard rock radio sort of sound. So it's an interesting fusion.
Because Steve Hackett, he's thoroughly one of the prog guitarists, although he's not that note dense.
No. Except for when he's doing the shredding thing, I guess.
Yeah, and he was early to that, I think, for one of the rock guitarists.
But typically he does like sort of these similar to like, you know, Spectral Mornings, this droney guitar sound sort of thing.
And I was thinking, like, obviously whether Pink Floyd or prog is debatable, but David Gilmour is more tasteful. He's not as shreddy or tappy, you know.
Nah, David Gilmour's big thing is they call it dive bombing. When I found out what that was, I was like, yes, the perfect description of what that sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. But so, I don't know. This album does fall into that sort of category of interesting 70s hard rock guitar sound. And some of, Freddie's vocal performances are like, they do live up to the hype of what that guy, this sort of acclaim he gets. Though, you said it was Brian May who did the vocals on All Dead.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that they have Freddie doing all the harmonies and stuff.
I assume,
all that sounds really good. And like you said, the last song, that should be considered a bit more of a classic. Just due to how big they are, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty beautiful song. So not being the biggest Queen fan, I can listen to this album and enjoy it just quite thoroughly, actually. Because even though it does have those moments of things, you know, I don't lean toward like 70s radio rock. It does it in an interesting way, and like you would describe with Homer Simpson in his bedroom. I think while I was listening to it, I thought about that, and I was like, yeah, this kind of is the essential like 70s teenage adolescent album.
Yes, yeah.
It's
only in an American context.
Yeah.
It's about being this is a very transatlantic album. It's obviously a British act, thoroughly. But
yeah. But it feels like they're aiming at an American audience.
Yeah. Some suburb in Wisconsin or something.
Sure, yeah. So it is an interesting artifact of that, certainly.
And it's worth mentioning the Queen productions were so considered impressive at the time that Frank Zappa himself, who was not the biggest, I don't think he was the biggest devotee of the band. I know he was vocal about liking Killer Queen, the song, and played it when he had radio gigs occasionally, but he thought the productions on the Queen album, and Zappa was obviously a top-of-the-line producer at this time, doing things that were very ahead of his time in the 70s, working, I think this is around the time he establishes the mobile utility muffin research kitchen.
I was gonna say something
his
about
home
muffins.
studio, yeah. And beautiful kind of use of words there. And yeah, he thought Queen's productions were unbelievable. He thought they were just stunning. He was just incredibly impressed by them. And it all factors in as to why, I still find myself quite interested in the group and felt like discussing them at least one more time in my life, here today, on Mandala. And I was very excited and very, very, very gratified to hear your thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting piece of like the hard rock story, mixed in with the hard rock world, because like the song like "Get Down, Make Love" is like dips into like the avant-garde in a very interesting way.
Yeah.
Like it's something you'd see like in a collaboration with like Peter Gabriel and Fripp.
Mm-hmm.
You got you get what I mean.
Absolutely.
Right? It's an interesting mixture of pop music and avant-garde music. It's an avant-pop song that has like a kind of hard rock chorus as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a mishmash of a lot of things, which is this album. And so I got to give it credit for that as well. Honestly, it might not hit all the time, but when it hits, it hits pretty hard. It's good stuff.
Yeah, big at least as well. Anyone who's seen the old Cosmic Criticism video, I'm a big fan of News of the World. Nothing has really changed about that. Felt compelled to celebrate it here again, perhaps for the last time on record, but I'm happy to have done so. I feel as though the record more than deserves it. And now, unless there's anything else, we shall be moving on to the very likeable and warmth-inducing Mondays, yes?
Yeah, these are happy Mondays. I think today's like Wednesday or something, but happy Mondays are for every day of the week. It's a perpetual happy Monday. Yeah, no, this album, this is a strange one, eh? It's a weird case of what would you describe it as? Like a weird like genre bending fusion of dance and rock music. There's sort of, the big story about it is the whole Manchester thing. They're a group from Manchester. They're sort of tied into that Stone Roses scene, the late 80s. And I guess apparently for this album, they got some like radio DJs to produce it after some of their tracks are being remixed into like Italo dance songs and stuff. And so this album like happens right at the time of like acid house kind of tipping over into mainstream popularity in England. Yeah, I was going
to say, this is the LP following in between the second, this is the third LP, in between the second Bummed and this one was the EP, which included that 6-minute Alleluia dance mix, which is their first real statement of, it's like their Fool's Gold, effectively.
Yeah, their Fool's Gold, that's true. And yeah, that's a great track.
Really, really good, yes.
Yeah, that dance mix.
So that was the real, probably solid mission statement, manifesto of where they were going for Pill Thrills.
Yeah, and that would have been, was that the second Summer of Love, or was that the year after?
I believe people say 88 is that year.
Okay.
I could be wrong.
But yeah, it's right around this time of the British, like, hippie revival, rave scene sort of thing. And so this album is like it's like the culmination of that movement in a weird way. And it's right at the end. Like, maybe this album might have killed that movement in a way. But like an album, I guess we'll talk about later, maybe you could, this is another sort of music trend that might have been played out, but you could attribute its death to the popularity of Nirvana, like everyone else, concludes. But I find this album is like probably the most interesting part about it, outside of the songs themselves, which are all killer, is just where it fits in as the culmination of that 80s rave scene, just before, and mixed with rock music as well, and then just before it sort of completely played out or like went off into a million different directions. You had this one album that sort of encapsulated all of it, and it's just like ridiculously fascinating and re-listenable, and like just as a sort of piece of like art pop, or sorry, pop art, you know, down to something like the cover, which I think is just like a collage of advertisements or something.
Yeah, it seems very late 60s.
Yeah, because it looks like a postcard, you know, those like Hawaii postcards or whatever. That's the font they use, I think. So yeah, it's just that mixed with all these like absurdist sort of like surrealist, maybe more so like poetry thoughts that are just like drug riddled and very interesting, like in a weird observational way, that are just being droned over by apparently like one of the hardest singers to work with because he was so self-conscious about his voice. Even though I reckon it sounds awesome. It's very unique. Obviously, he doesn't sing very traditionally. He's just sort of droning on in almost like similar to the Stone Roses guy, but he more tries to sing, I suppose.
Yeah, Brown.
Ian Brown, yeah. But yeah, he'll just like he's essentially doing like a beat poetry reading over these, like for the time, cutting edge like rave dance productions, but done in such a like digestible way. Like they're really going to try to push this movement into the mainstream. That's kind of this album in a way, even though it is, I guess by nature of the scene, it falls into like strange sort of surrealist places, which maybe is why it could never go completely mainstream, especially in England, because apparently they really wanted to push like this band and the Stone Roses and a bunch of that stuff in England. But the only one that I think was a hit was that You're Unbelievable song.
Yeah, what's the name of that group? Like OMF or something?
Something like that. I can't recall.
Yeah.
But that's the one Manchester song that was popular in America. And they really tried to push the scene there. They really wanted it to break in America. So this album is just like it's the point where all that, it's like the artifact of that. Because the Stone Roses album, I suppose, you can point back to it being like an artifact of that sort of retrospective psychedelia pop that, you know, someone
Very
like
60s, yeah.
Yeah, that sort of world. It's a retake on that in the neo-psychedelic sense.
I mean, Bye Bye Bad Man's about the May 68 protests, if nothing else.
Yeah, wow, there you go. That's hilarious. But yeah, and rather than going in that, like I suppose you eventually did get something like the Acid House and the scene that this band came from eventually became like jungle and stuff like that. There were new elements at play in jungle that didn't just come from that scene.
No, yeah.
So I suppose there's someone like a guy called Gerald, who I think started in 808.
Yeah.
I think that's, I guess, one of the sort of crossovers of those sort of worlds. So they did cross over a bit, I think. But as far as rock music went in England, it went back to the retrospective thing people say, right? With Blur and Oasis.
Yeah.
And typically trying to rewrite 60s pop into 90s alternative rock.
People like Reynolds and Fisher called regressive rock, which was worse than prog even, in their minds, which is quite amusing to think about.
Yeah, and it's, I suppose, like, it's not a genre I listen to much of, because there isn't a lot that's good at, you know, the like dance rock sort of stuff. This sort of dance rock fusion genre. But, like, it's a shame that it just went a bit more trashy disco sometimes in the 90s, you know, British pop electronic music.
Yeah.
To sort of broadly pigeonhole. But, yeah, this, I guess I just got to appreciate this album for being the culmination of all of that. And on top of that, having, like, every song is a great bloody song. Like, all the, like, hits, right? I think there's, like, 3 or 4 of them that were hits in England.
Yeah.
But then all the album tracks are ridiculously good as well. Like, I suppose one of the elements of, I remember reading somewhere, people always go on about how the movement's sort of like hedonistic. And there's a hilarious song in there called Bob's Your Uncle.
Oh, yeah, it's very
like
raunchy.
Vaguely pornographic. But the thing is, like, of all the styles this album's mixing, there's that 70s, like, porn wah-wah guitar. It's like one of the weird genre mashing elements that made up this sort of style of music. And, like, I don't know what's so weird about, like, why people are calling the scene, like, hedonistic in the sense of, like, it just trying to be about, like, a positive movement. Like, you know, it's weird that people tie, especially music, which is typically quite, because it's, you know, creative endeavor, it's typically done by people that aren't ultra conservative or conformist.
Puritan, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a weird sort of interpretation that maybe some music snobs, a corner of music snobbery I've noticed where they'll point out certain scenes and things like that being like hedonistic or something along those lines. But like, would you prefer having a scene where that comes along that is promoting a sort of, like, of course there would have been gangsterisms and things like that in every scene, because they eventually get corrupted, but the whole idea, the themes of like this music is to sort of just kick back, smoke weed all day, and then go out and get on the chems and dance all night. Like, well, that seems like a pretty good resolution for people who are just trying to be really uptight, you know?
It's no less hedonistic than the late 60s, frankly.
Yeah, well, that's why it's kind of, I guess, a revival. And so it's just strange that, like, the only preference someone would have, like, philosophically opposed to the scene would be to just go to your job, work all day, you know, sort of go home and sleep it off. Like, the sort of things that people talk about disappointing them about contemporary life.
Yeah.
You know? So that's like the weird irony. It's like, wouldn't you prefer it to be there a certain freedom, you know?
Anyone's got a problem with that song Bob's Your Uncle must have a huge issue. Bob's Your Uncle's part of the course for contemporary music. Not that that's a bad thing necessarily, but like, I've heard many and there's very mainstream songs which are just as dirty as Bob's Your Uncle now.
I don't know if anyone has a specific like sort of qualm with that song, but I guess I'm just citing that as an example of where it could be considered hedonistic. But it's like all in good fun. It's a party album, you know. It's sort of, I guess, similar to a theme that I remember once reading in criticism about the last album I'll speak about, which is a 60s album. And it just reminds me of that sort of thing. It's just like, rather than having a sort of interesting historical view on these things, like they'll like, you know, compare it to contemporary moral standards.
Yeah.
It's strange.
Yeah,
but anyway, that's that's why this album is like off your rocker, because it is like weirdly philosophical in like a sort of pop art and like McLuhan in a sense, right? It's very downstream of punk. Like, this is what punk was meant to become.
Yeah, it's very like an organic evolution. Yeah,
that's how I feel about this album. What do you reckon?
This is a brilliant album. I think it's utterly superlative, and if there's one problem I have to identify with it, is that it is just not bummed. With the Martin Hannett production, the references to Rogue and Camel's performance, with just that, you're rendering that scaffolding dangerous. Fucking fat lady wrestlers and Germans in trenches and teachers who speak to themselves sometimes. I Bummed is the one. Like, for me, I adore the hell out of that album, and this is this is their second best statement, to be fair. This is also a masterpiece. The Happy Mondays had one of the 5 best shticks in 20th century rock music, along with like Devo, Kraftwerk, if that's rock, Zappa, and like Gabriel Genesis around Lambs. I mean, my goodness. And you know, isn't that the most exciting philosophy summed up in a group's name? Happy Mondays. Happy Mondays.
Yeah.
Isn't that right there a window into a preferable societal spectrum than the one we're living in now? I mean, imagine that. Happy Mondays. Now, that can be taken either way. That can mean you've found a way to kind of flourish between capitalism and the market economy, or it could mean we're in this liberated, socialist, free-form, Thomas More-esque, beautiful landscape. Now, maybe Thomas More is being ironic. Let's go to a university professor and ask his opinion. Now, there's just... I feel like it's such an exciting group, and I think I've often read that the downfall of this group... Now, I like the 4th album they put out, but I think a lot of people aren't too happy with that one. I think they felt like the drugs got to the band and then the drugs kind of took over the work ethic.
I'm sure that did happen.
I'm sure that did happen, but I think you have to be realistic and in the nicest possible way. I don't know if the band were going to make interesting music outside of that compositional ethos, and that simply is what it is, and I'm not faulting them for it. I'm not. I think they're more exciting than most of the groups that were more quote sober unquote. I mean, is there any Oasis anyone feels like listening to? I don't know. I've never been the Oasis guy personally.
No, they're just on cigarettes and alcohol. Nothing that interesting.
Yeah, it's just, to me, this is one of the groups that makes me feel most excited about life. And I think if there's any late 20th century group that we can learn a little lesson from, and kind of try to, liven up the contemporary with, it's the Happy Mondays. I think that's too often dismissed as this moment of, not dismissed, but like relegated to a moment of naive euphoria at like the dawn. Thatcher's coming to a close and pre-New Labour and pre-9/11. It's like, we can relish. It's like this kind of sort of little safe space moment. But actually, I think, it wasn't the easiest time in the world. I mean, even in the UK, I think that's kind of a naive to think that, things are been particularly stable for absolutely everyone. I mean, it's not exactly the rich London suburbs this music is originating from. It's from, Manchester's not historically the most affluent area on the island, necessarily. And I think you just get this worldview of, like that 70s freeform, 70s is a very depressing time in terms of, crime rates and disasters worldwide, international tensions, and yet you have that great retrospectives of the 70s, this kind of fun, funky, chill out time. And that comes from this sort of Zen pathology which permeates through 1970s popular culture, which saw a great, palpable, tangible articulation within the Mondays in the late 80s and early 90s. I think they're sincerely one of the most materially, and not in an abstract sense, materially, and that too though, fascinating groups in the history of popular music. And I can't stress enough how much enthusiasm that the Mondays inject into the possibilities of that feeling of it's kind of worth considering the philosophy of the trip here. I think there's two ways of looking at the trip. As a temporary moment which you long and lust after the trip is over, or this enlightening and elucidating moment which informs that future, even when once it becomes the present, even if one is not in the trip, that trip, or the possibility of future insights from subsequent trips becomes a validation of the day-to-day rather than a motivation to escape from it. And I always feel like that's a pitfall both ascribed to those who observe sort of psychedelic subcultures and within, to some degree, the psychedelic subcultures themselves, wherein it becomes too much of a recreational, almost the equivalent of like going to the pub so you can forget phenomenon, rather than an act of encouraging one to creatively restructure the world around them, whether it's on a psychological basis or whether that's in taking incremental steps to shift around, potentially materially, the world around you. The bottom line is it's one of the last really popular groups to encourage, and you can take it as a celebration of a potential day-to-day, 9-to-5 stability, or you could take it as motivation and a springboard to change/improvement. And whereas a lot of other groups are simply relegated to, hey, here's some exciting material you can play via the CD or the speakers as you come home from work, the Happy Mondays offers the proposal that work can be transcended or even potentially fun, and therefore transcended via being the old phrase going. If you're having fun working, you are not working. The Mondays may be one of the last really interesting things in British music, but that's not true because obviously there was a wealth of interesting things in the 90s, like Richard David James and so on.
Sure, yeah.
But as far as like rock groups go, possibly the last one. Let's suggest that, at least for a moment now. Anything else to share on the group?
No, except for it's definitely true because transcending working or having fun while working isn't working. Apparently Sean Ryder was like a postman. Nice.
Oh yeah, I want to briefly mention Paul Ryder, one of the greatest bassists of all time. Where are these brilliant bassists coming from in England?
Yeah, no.
From Peter Hook to the Gang of Four bassists to Pop Group. Even listening like Frankie Goes to Hollywood, like that guy was very, very. I know Trevor Horn maybe recorded over some of that stuff, but
the biggest market for like soul and funk music outside of America was England. They loved the American imports of that stuff. So I think a lot of kids grew up listening to like these sort of bass lines. And by the punk era, they started incorporating them into the music.
Think about the bass lines in like the Soul album by Associates, like oh
yeah. There's a lot of good bassists from that era.
That the four bassists.
That's the best part of like Simple Minds, for example.
Oh, Derek Forbes is fantastic. Yeah, no, I forgot about him. He's brilliant.
Even things like Orange Juice.
Oh, he's the best. Yeah.
Peter Hook, I suppose, as well. That's a weird take on the bass, though. That's very different. But yeah, lots of interesting bassists from England somehow.
Yeah, absolutely astonishing. I think. God Almighty. Oh, speaking of interesting bassists, I think we are moving on.
Yeah.
A cool bass-oriented band, though. Unless you're a real fan of the group, you don't often think of them as a bass-oriented group. That's the Big Bad. Here we go. We're going to represent Iron Maiden today briefly, I think. Or maybe. We'll see how long we go. Why Peace of Mind? Well, because my favourite's actually Somewhere in Time, although the reason I'm talking about Peace of Mind is because I think Peace of Mind is the really greatest composite Maiden album.
Yeah.
And there's the reason why I wanted to bring up Maiden and one of the stronger 80s Maiden albums in particular is because, well, one, I enjoy them, but also I've always really liked Iron Maiden, and it was easy to get into Maiden as like kind of an adolescent geek, history, the occult, just intensive sword and sorcery, lyrical imagery. Maiden's just got a plethora of all of this. The appeal is not dissimilar to Rush, who we will get to shortly, actually, or relatively shortly. And despite Maiden not being not prog band, but we had long songs, epic instrumental suites. Again, as I said, the lyrical subject matter. Maiden is very easy for a prog fan to get into, I feel, especially compared to, I don't dislike Judas Priest, but Maiden was a lot more appealing. All the visual art of the records, plus the seriousness with which they took the subject matter as well. That incorporated into live show props, or there's all sorts of Iron Maiden artwork, even outside of the LP sleeves. There's posters and single artworks. You can find, the gatefolds. There's Derek Riggs or whomever it was doing lots of great work for this group.
The song's about flying like an eagle.
Hell yeah. Now, but why is all the focus on 80s Maiden? Well, here's the thing. It's fair to say that in 1990, once Adrian Smith left the group, we had a bit of a downturn with No Prayer for the Dying, which was trying to consciously be a bit more simplistic and following trends in mainstream American and British heavy metal at that time. It's not a very compelling album, frankly. And Fear of the Dark's a bit better, but not on par with the older stuff. And we start to think, maybe Adrian Smith is an ingredient there, perhaps. Dickinson leaving, those two albums aren't the strongest, particularly the second, Virtual 11 or XI. It's not that great. Probably the weakest thing they ever put out. But I actually have the opinion that the first three of those reunion albums, by reunion I mean both Dickinson and Smith came back, and they kept Smith's replacement Janet Gurr, making them a free lead guitarist outfit, which is a bit controversial to the fans, but I'm not going to get into that specifically. They don't like some of the live antics of Janet Gurr, but I don't. That's none of my business personally. I don't go see live shows.
They don't like the live antics of what's her name, Sharon Osbourne.
Oh, that's the story. Yeah, no, but they definitely do not like that. That's very historical. Yeah. I think Brave New World, Dance of Death, and A Matter of Life and Death are worthy of 80s Maiden. And so the point I'm making is I don't want to make it seem like to me it's silly that like Maiden had it and then they didn't have, because I always find it curious as to why bands have it and then they don't have it. And to me it always seemed as though depressing the idea that Maiden would lose it, because it is kind of a simple formula and they're so passionate about it. But I don't think they did lose it, contrary to the popular opinion. Martin Birch's production is missed to some extent, but like times change, you kind of have to accept that a little bit. And I don't think Maiden go too bad in the kind of microwave sound of rock and metal, hard rock and metal in the early 21st century, turn of the millennium in general. So I'm on board with Brave New World, Dance of Death, and Matter of Life and Death. The next three lose me a little bit. Final Frontier's too bloated with just ideas and like production effects and long songs which go nowhere, but I feel like the fans love the longer songs, and so the band are like, let's make longer songs. The problem is they had interesting ideas for long songs first, rather than just the motivation to do a long song, and I feel like that kind of they lose that kind of fascinating motivation. Book of Souls, not that interesting. Production's too studio and clean for me. Hi-fi, I like when Power Slave sounds like it's in a pyramid, or Number of the Beast sounds like it could be in hell, or Somewhere in Time in some cyberpunk, tavern. Like that's the Maiden. I like that sound preferably, And then Senjutsu's just trying too hard. I mean, I don't know, man. Not for. It's trying too hard to appease Iron Maiden fans, and I say that as not a hardcore, but I guess a fairly basic Iron Maiden fan. Someone who does think they've put some really great records out. So, but all things considered, in terms of the material on the albums, yeah, you can't go wrong with, the self-titled debut Until Seventh Son. Great streak. I'm happy to include the first three of the 21st Century albums in that tier as well. But Peace of Mind, I think, is the best composite of what they're all about. Somewhere in Time, there's a specific theme going on, and a certain production sound, which is why it's my personal favourite. But Peace of Mind is when they moved on from just singing about the occult and sort of urban English crime melodrama, which is awesome. I appreciate that stuff very immensely. And then you get all the historical narratives, homages to literature and cinema. Obviously, the first track is a direct reference to the classic World War II picture from 1968, Where Eagles Dare, starring Richard Burton and Clint Eastwood. Fantastic film, that. Great to see it involved here. Revelations about, mythology and the apocalypse, eschatology. Really cool. Not the most interesting. It's alright compositionally, but it's more the kind of imagery of the lyrics which are captivating there. Flight of Icarus, again, about Greek mythology there. Historical wars, of course. The Frenchman did surmise, Dire of Rebutes on, and The Trooper. I did a Year 10 speech in high school about The Trooper. I could have done that at War Pigs. I did The Trooper for whatever reason. It's slightly embarrassing now, but it got good marks, I guess, so whatever, that's nice enough. Obviously, that's about the Charge of the Light Brigade, which, a lot of people died in that clash between British and Russian forces in the 19th century during the Crimean War, and obviously that's famously dramatized in the Michael Curtiz film Charge of the Light Brigade from 1936, as well as Tony Richardson's film from 1968. Not as many people died in the 1936 production, although infamously lots of horses did, and Errol Flynn wasn't happy about that. Errol Flynn ought to have been grateful that it wasn't Michael Curtiz's Noah's Ark production of 1928, during the silent era in which a lot of people nearly drowned, including one Marion, later known as John Wayne.
Yeah, John Wayne.
He was an extra there, nearly drowned. Could have changed history very, very sharply. In any case, then, Still Life is not that interesting compositionally, but good lyrical imagery, and obviously it inspired the title and the album art, which is very cool. That's one of the best art they ever did. It's not anyone's best art. That's so cool. I had a figurine of that back at my parents' place, actually. I got it from Utopia Records. I can't not buy that. That's super cool. Quest for Fire, named after the interesting caveman film from 1981, which was directed by Jean-Jacques Arnaud, and actually had a fictional language devised by Anthony Burgess. It's an interesting film. But people hate the lyrics because it describes dinosaurs and man living side by side. Not the case in the film, obviously. So it's like, Did you see the film? Like, what's going on?
Yeah.
Southern Steel kicks a lot of ass. I like that a lot. And then they were one of the first groups to identify that Frank Herbert did not agree that the novel Dune was metal as fuck.
Yeah.
Oh my god, I love To Tame a Land. It's like the best thing. Just the fact that Maiden do a Dune song is like, they wanted to call it Dune, but Frank Herbert said no, so Bruce Dickinson called him a cunt during a live show, basically. And it's the best thing they've ever did, almost. I don't think he did. Which is interesting because, just a brief anecdote, you know the album art you viewers saw earlier for Queen News of the World? That's a re-illustration. That's an artist redoing his own work. It was the cover of like Astounding Science Fiction, one of those magazines in the late 50s. And Roger Taylor had that magazine as a boy, that issue. And they wanted to remake that cover for News of the World. And they contacted the original artist. And the original artist, he wasn't a big fan of rock music, as it were. So he wasn't really of Queen's music, but he decided to do it and not listen to Queen's music because he was afraid he would not care for the group's music and then it would put him off it. But of course, wants to be nice, and plus, that's probably a pretty healthy paycheck, right?
Yeah.
So he does it. And then it turned out, he claimed that when he did listen to Queen's music, he rather enjoyed it. So that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, as opposed to Maiden.
Yeah. Apparently the letter went, Frank Herbert does not like hard rock or heavy metal groups, and especially groups like Iron Maiden. Something very specific like that. That's how the if you will, legend goes. But no, in the end, Peace of Mind, other than Somewhere in Time, I think is the most satisfying Maiden album. And the reason I talked so much about the wider discography is because I didn't want to get into this thing of, the group was good and then they weren't good, because, sometimes it's obvious why, we talk about a lot of punk and pop groups, it's obvious why they go a bit bad. Like, the punks kind of grow up a bit. Some of the art punks do individual cool solo careers, like every Robin Hitchcock or David Sylvain or Mayo Thompson, if he counts, I don't know. Whereas some individuals, some of the pop acts, when you're based around technology and, you kind of have to be in with the right producers at the right time sometimes to really make things work as far as, music production technology goes. And in the end, we have the appeal of Iron Maiden. Like I said, this is the composite great Maiden record, and though I like Somewhere in Time more for a couple of reasons, I think the track list is better, and I think that's my favourite Maiden track list. The production, all the effects, the lyrical imagery, subject matter, definitely my favourite on artwork. Definitely I'm going to go to Somewhere in Time if I had to choose one, but yeah, I guess I wanted to use Peace of Mind as my avenue to talk about Maiden in general, and it's better to use Peace of Mind for the reasons I suggested, because it's more indicative of their whole oeuvre, because this is the most influential album on the rest, maybe Powerslave as well, but the Number of the Beast, one is the Clive Bird drumming, so it's a bit of a different sound on the first three albums, even when you got Dickinson on Number of the Beast. But also it's got the more occult and sort of English crime melodrama focus on the first three.
Yeah, like the Jack the Ripper sort of stuff. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, 22 Acacia Avenue, Gangland, which they get more, European and historical, mythological for the lyrical subject matter going forward. Even doing a concept record, rock opera thing, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son 88. Prog metal, they call
go back to England for Rhymes of the Ancient Mariner.
Good point.
Which, as far as the epics go, I always like that one.
That's a great one.
The Dune song's really good, but as a whole, the Rhymes of the Ancient Mariner, that one's just epic in the sort of mythological sense, I suppose.
Yeah, that's me championing Iron Maiden on this snobby music show. Take it away if you like.
Well, I'm sure metal snobs would really like Iron Maiden.
Oh, of course they do.
That's their band.
Absolutely,
right?
that's
So it fits in, I suppose.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, as any fan of music, especially rock music more broadly, but just sort of, I suppose someone who was even into classical music would, unless you're Frank Herbert, somewhat see what's interesting about Iron Maiden, if not just the operatic vocals of what's his face?
Bruce Dickinson.
The football manager.
Yeah.
I love how he went from looking like a metal impish elf to looking like a football manager.
Yeah.
I couldn't imagine just seeing Iron Maiden now and just being why is do I not like that guy singing?
Graham Taylor. Yeah, Dickinson's always got his beanie on now. They're
really?
practicing in the cold, yeah.
Wow, yeah, he's gone like full beatnik, I suppose now.
Mm.
But yeah, no, this album, it probably isn't my favorite Maiden album. I don't know if I have one particular favorite Maiden album. There are parts I like of like all their albums throughout that classic run. Not as familiar with the '90s albums or the 21st century ones, except for Brave New World and Dance of Death. I've heard those ones, and that's kind of a return to form, I suppose. Not really my thing, but their early albums are really good, and I think this one is like indicative of like. It's a good choice for this sort of thing if you just want to talk about Iron Maiden in general as well, because it's sort of conducive of all their. It's like it's the most traditional metal album they probably did, but like just done in such a way that's like Maiden are great because of I just love their rhythm sections. Like you were saying before, the early albums have a different drummer, and it's more of like a steady gallop or whatever, but. Who's the drummer on this album?
Nico McBrain, going forward.
Yeah, okay, and mixed in with the bassist,
Steve Harris, yeah.
Steve Harris's bass stuff. It always feels like you're tumbling as opposed to like thrashing or like chugging. It's a sort of unique take on metal instrumentals, and sometimes the lyrics and the allusions, like you mentioned, the French surmised, and the Flight of the Icarus.
Oh yeah.
It's just, like sometimes Maiden do fall into that category of just being a bit tasteless with these sort of things. But like if you can sort of suspend disbelief and enjoy the fantasy aspect of it, I think it's sort of worth doing. And because musically they're very interesting as well, I let them get away with it.
Yeah.
Similar to the next band of your pick we'll talk about.
Oh yeah.
They're similar in that aspect, but because there's so much going on musically, you go along for the thematic sort of aspect of it. As opposed to something which you wouldn't find interesting musically, you could care less what it's about or whatever. So Iron Maiden do sort of like they elaborate on that like fantastical rock music in a very natural way as well, where like they incorporated elements of punk and mixed it into 70s proto metal and hard rock and fantasy prog sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And it melds it all into like it makes sense that all these albums sort of happened at that time. Throughout the early 80s and through to the late 80s, and they sort of started growing and changing. But then I suppose they eventually did just become sort of self-reflective a little bit and sort of just echo them. They became a whole genre, essentially.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of weight to put on a band to like keep making interesting or different new music when you become a whole genre, I suppose. But, which is why this album was a good example to choose, because this is like that genre.
Yeah.
Most sort of articulately expressed.
Yeah.
Is this album. Yeah, and even though it's maybe not personally my favourite Maiden album, it's easily one of their best.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
one of my favourites, Maiden's interesting. I could point to a different one of the albums through that classic run as my favourite at a different time, because they're just all... Even though Maiden do, like, sort of rewrite the same song over and over again.
Yeah, they can, yeah.
They, like, that's why I don't sort of... Like, I can sort of listen to the albums interchangeably, and they can be my favourite, because, like, they're mostly the same musical ideas, just expressed in slight variations.
Yeah, that's true.
But, I can sort of, like I was saying before, go on board with their sort of thematic things, and just their interesting, like, sort of fantasy vision is quite enjoyable.
Hell yeah.
Especially as, like, popcorn music and visceral sort of, like I said, you're tumbling.
Yeah, it's very adolescent, it's very masturbatory, it's very pizza sauce, but yeah, I really like it myself.
Yeah, no, it's good for that.
There's a time and a place for it, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's good for that. And it's pretty accessible, and it's not an example of like metal experimenting, but it's just sort of traditional rock metal done in an interesting way.
Hell yeah.
With the touches of the proggy stuff, that maybe one criticism is that the songs might go for a bit long because they just extend them with solo passages or something.
Yeah.
In a very sort of artificial way sometimes.
That's my criticism of like the last 3 records.
Yeah, that's maybe, and they've fallen into that habit, maybe worse in more recent albums.
Yeah.
And that's maybe the one criticism I could give to their songwriting.
Mm-hmm.
That and like the same sort of thing, but they managed to make it work, and it's like a sort of hammer horror.
Yeah.
Fantasy, historical, mythological, medieval, old modern, sort of aesthetic, all those sort of things. They make the music into something more than it is. So I can enjoy it for that. And this album is pretty crazy.
You heard it here first, everyone. Mandala endorses Iron Maiden. If you thought that was never going to happen, or if you think this is unpredictable, I mean, we're full of surprises over here.
Yeah, no, Maiden is sick.
And now we're going to move on to, oh, wow. This is the most intimidating release discussed so far in Mandala. Holy fuck, man. I never would have
yeah.
I would have been too scared to pick this.
There's a lot to say about this album, I suppose, but I think a lot of it's sort of implicit in the music itself, and it's very subjective to one's own personal experience, So people will have their own interpretations on this album. Some people might turn it off straight away and just be like, no, not in the mood. Maybe it'll stick in their heads and they'll come back to it years later and be like, what was that? And then listen to it again with a completely different perspective. But yeah, that's sort of the nature of this one, the KLF's chill out album. Like, I suppose the party's over, the pills and the thrills and the belly aches are done, and you gotta go into the chill room, like I would have mentioned on a previous show, within this movement of British electronic music.
I think in relation to Ski Mask, I think.
Ski Mask? Yeah.
Rudy Column.
The Rudy Column,
Sorry.
yeah. But yeah, so this album was apparently conceived out of the idea of the chill room at a club, where, sort of, if you're done with the loud dance music, you just want to chill out for a bit, smoke a cigarette, or the drugs are coming on too strong, you need to get into a different space. They'd have a chill out room with, down-tempo beats playing, or something like this, which is an early sort of conception out of that philosophy of the chill room. And this album is I found this album interesting from the moment I first listened to it, but then the more I listened to it, and the more I sort of like read about where it came from, like the idea of the chill room and stuff like that, the more fascinated I became by it. For example, apparently it was all recorded in like one take as a DJ mix. Like they would constantly, they had this mix in mind and they'd sort of pre-written it and they decided to choreograph it and try and get it in one perfect take. And so you get a weird like mixture of, I suppose, the rocker sense of live music, but done all through electronic DJ equipment.
Mm-hmm.
And they end up making this strange album. Like, I suppose the KLF, it's a long biographical story to this group. Like, they
we talked about the Mondays having like an interesting philosophic disposition.
Yeah.
This one does get into both the material and the abstract very densely.
The abstract very densely. But yeah, I suppose this album is their big experiment, more so into the material. Maybe the White Room too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe the White Room more so, because this is fairly abstract. Whereas that's more like a dance album. But yeah, the KLF start out of this sort of... They're these two older guys who come from an earlier period. They come from like the like end of the glam rock, sort of start of the punk era. And then eventually, like by the 80s, like we're influenced by a book series called the Illuminatus Trilogy, by Robert Anton Wilson. That was his name, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Which is a weird, like, out there sort of book series, and this group draws from the mythology of that whole thing, and so they have this weird, out there, vaguely psychedelic, inspired by the '60s and sort of audio experiments from then. Think John Lennon doing Revolution 9, being inspired by Music Concrete and various other sort of things. So there's a bit of that going on within their philosophy, and a bit of like that, what they call Operation Mindfuck as well, which was an inspiration on this Robert Anton Wilson book. So the KLF draw from the mythology of this sort of like sci-fi conspiracy series of books from the 70s, and then they incorporate that into their philosophy of music creation. And so this album is a sort of, like I said, it's strange that it's choreographed, but they've drawn, I guess they've sort of pre-written or weaved all the samples and various musical elements of it, and to sort of trying to meet the two worlds of that Dada improvisation, sample delia sort of music, but also like new age ambient, like experience music. Like this album is trying to emulate a road trip through the American South. And so it's just full of that imagery, very much so, you know, train noises and sheep, you know, barring. And I remember reading once, what's the main guy in this group?
Bill Drummond?
Yeah, Drummond. He once wrote that the sound of he found, like, ever since he was a kid, the sound of a steel string guitar, you know, that old country sound, is like this, like, the sound of the heart, like, yearning, or something like that, and like, it's the sweetest noise in the world. And so this album, like, is just full of those sounds being manipulated electronically, and there are many passages with that sound, for example, and it's so interesting that, like, he's drawing from his childhood to create these sort of sounds, and like, I never really appreciated the sound of a steel string guitar until you hear it manipulated on this album. And so there's things like that, like there's like throat singing that comes in, sounds of crickets even, so it's got all the sheep, yeah, it's got all the new age, like, sort of fundamental elements of field recording new age music, but then it's mixed in with, like, I guess, yeah, like the chill out room, like a club philosophy of, like, dance and disco samples over, like, samples of, like, a preacher who has the best spiel ever. Like, he's talking about, like, going down in New Jersey and getting fat as a rat and da-da-da-da and this and this and that. And it's, like, one of the funniest samples I think I've ever heard. It's so engaging. It's kind of ridiculous. And, yeah, it's just so dense with all these sort of different elements, and it definitely does create a unique subjective experience, I feel. It's like the sort of thing that, it's a classic example of music ambience, and not to be, like, sort of, I suppose it's like proto-hauntology in the sense of, like, you're not actively listening to it, you're letting it wash over you, and the memories are sort of, whether it's your memories or, like, shared memories, sort of penetrate your headspace, you know, but you sort of submit yourself to, like, interesting imagery, you know, like, for example, at one point you hear, like, a brief clip of, like, Elvis fading in
the ghetto,
yeah, a slight clip of that, and then before the chorus kicks in, it then fades out, and this is as a train goes by, and so it has all these elements of, like, weird, like, memory timing, you know. It's a strange, like, experiential experiment, I feel. And I think it was conceived as that, and honestly, I feel it sort of executes. And it's the sort of album you don't listen to all the time, but every time you listen to it, there's just more you get out of it. It's the album that keeps on giving. That's how I feel.
I can't stress enough, this is one of the greatest records of all time.
Yeah.
This is, I mean, let me tell you, let me explain, hopefully briefly, what I get out of it, because I feel like it feels like quite a lot to me. Because this makes me feel as though I was born in 1996, and this makes me think of that idyllic sort of, that new British consensus of, like, post-Thatcher sort of neoliberal consensus, which is, like, briefly utopic and idyllic. You know how when Victor Mildrew retires and one foot in the grave and he expects everything to kind of go well, and this is this nice idyllic southern England suburb, things keep going wrong, but there's this expectation that this sort of, like, BBC reality will come true and everything's sort of categorical and ordered. I used to watch these little kid shows where the Jim Henson alien Muppets would come down to the UK, the Hoobs, and then they would find out about how life works. And everything, the baker does the baking, the banker does the banking, and it's we go to school on the bus, and it was so idyllic. And you had this idea of like England or even Australia, which is similar enough. You could project it onto my surrounding suburbs, which are where I grew up was fairly nice and upper middle class, frankly, and so it all coalesces into this. This album is I think it's kind of tapping into or prophesizing that headspace and that I especially post Cold War, you understand this sort of mentality which feels to permeate UK culture at this time, and there's that very kind of pleasant normalcy which makes me think of when I was in preschool. Sorry,
is this the same year as Pills and Thrills?
Yes.
Yeah, 1990, right? Okay, yeah.
But yeah, no, it's just such a... That's the kind of thing it makes me think of, and so it's very, idyllic, that sort of post-Cold War, pre-9/11 moment, and, or what I would consider, like, making me think of the TV, a videotape era, pre-internet, or the major, home computers in every house phenomenon. It makes me think of what I consider a very happy, peaceful, stable time in the Anglophone world, let's say. At least in the UK/Australia. Let's throw New Zealand in there as well. Why not, guys? And yeah, it's a very, to me, it's one of those interesting albums of all time, compositionally and thematically, and also just personally, pathologically. I think the KLF are one of the most, when's the last time a popular music act were that, as long as the Happy Mondays. Well, Happy Mondays are your qualifying rock groups. In terms of popular music acts, period, yeah, KLF, my God. And setting a standard for, I think, they may be the first of these big 90s electronic UK acts. And then you get Aphex Twin following on from that, Audica, Orbital, all this other interesting work, Prodigy. I was almost going to mention earlier, you remember the Happy Mondays ever comeback album in the 21st century? I feel like it's the album they wanted to make, but it's a bit too kind of dingy Prodigy for me. You know how like most of the Prodigy albums, especially after Fat of the Land, are kind of dodgy?
Sure.
A bit like that, frankly, to me. I guess good effort, guys, but I mean, like most of the Prodigy, other than Fat of the Land, doesn't do a heck of a lot for me, but they nailed it with that release, for sure, for absolutely sure. But, so I'm a huge fan of the KLF and of Chill Out. I think I'll pause here and let you continue / finish with this one.
Yeah, no, I'm just sort of astounded of how good this album is, to be honest. Like, yeah, where it fits into its scene, its time, its place. But more than that, it's just it's a rare case of like improvisation mixing with sort of like choreography, and just like it's a strange like audio experiment more than anything else. Yet it's done in such a way that you would think of it along the lines of like popular music, like even like the rocker sort of sense of the albums you're talking about, like the post Beatles idea of an album being an artful sort of ongoing vision art piece as opposed to compilation of songs.
Yeah.
So, like, unlike most electronic and dance music, this is a weird sort of melding of those two worlds, But more so than anything, though, I suppose like the Happy Mondays or like Fool's Gold, it's the sort of thing that if you played to a rockist, they would probably just think it's useless noise.
Yeah, it's not music or whatever.
Yeah, which is unfortunate.
Yeah.
There should be a marrying of like I suppose the three worlds of rockism, poptimism, and avant-gardism. Because like as I'll get to with my next one, like there's a nice nexus point where all those things meet. And this album is kind of one of them. This album's a nexus point of many things, you know. It's and most uniquely, like, consciously so. That's probably what's so fascinating about the jamming, the jammer, cultural jammer philosophy of like Operation Mindfuck and things like that. And similar to the next album, it just it's so contemporaneous to the sort of current streams of cultural communication we have now, but just done in such an analog fashion. I find it fascinating that we haven't sort of dug into the history too much of how these sort of things affect the current stream of culture that we live in, you know. I think it's a clear, like, sort of blueprint of where we're at now. So yeah, I suppose blueprint. I'll get into more of that on my next one. So I guess we'll pass it off for now.
Yeah, I guess the last thing I want to say about Chill Out, I just quickly remember this. It's one of the most interesting, like, British takes on, like, the American aesthetic. Because sometimes that outsider aesthetic is more fascinating in the English perspective.
And the southern perspective as well. Or at least travelling from the north to the south. It's a travelogue album as well.
Yeah, I consider some of the more fascinating British perspectives on America throughout media and art in the late 20th century. Take, for instance, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons in Watchmen. Or a lot of those British artists doing takes on the American characters in general. Or you could look at the British director of the 60s kind of British New Wave era, John Schlesinger, directing Midnight Cowboy, Bloody Sunday, Marathon Man, and The Falcon and the Snowman.
I didn't realise he was British. There you go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you wouldn't think so, but also you would, because
sure.
he takes that outsider perspective. Or, of course, someone like Peter Watkins on Punishment Park, if you want to go there.
Sure.
Anyway, I guess on a lighter note, let's move on to the fusion of those two things. British, American, Canadian. Rush. So Rush were an easy band to get into as an adolescent, of course. I like prog rock and some degree of liking, or wanting to like heavy metal music.
Archer.
So, I got into Archer a little bit later. Rush were very, very, very cool. And when I was an adolescent, I really gravitated towards, say, like 1976, 2112, up to like 1981 Moving Pictures. I thought those were the really cool albums, ones that appealed to me. Over time, I remember getting more into being really fascinated with the 1982 release Signals. And this, when I was like 19, 20, I was really into Signals. And I was finding that a really interesting release. And like, well, yeah, I can lump Signals in as one of the interesting Rush albums. Because Rush have quite a lot of albums, very long discography. We all know, perhaps, maybe you don't, the first album, 1974, doesn't have Neil Peart, has John Rutsey on drums. And it's kind of a straightforward hard rock release. And it's plausibly the least interesting thing they've put out. Fly By Night, when Neil Peart joins, this is a great one. Caress of Steel, really, really good prog release. I don't know, some people have mixed feelings on it. I'm a big fan of it. And as I inferred earlier, 2112.
It's like avant-garde hard rock.
Yeah, good point, actually. 2112, great. Like Feral the Kings a lot. Hemispheres is cool as. Actually, Permanent Waves I was never as hot on. It's okay. It's okay. Moving Pictures is very brilliant. That was the best thing they put out up to that point. Got to the point. Signals, man. Signals is fucking brilliant, though. And I'm liking Signals so much that I want to explore. Why haven't I been... I think I've been neglecting the later albums. And eventually it gets to the point, yeah, I'm getting into Grace Under Pressure, Power Windows. And now I'm at the point. The Rush albums I gravitate to the most are not just Moving Pictures to Grace Under Pressure, but to Power Windows, and even to Hold Your Fire and Presto, which I really, really like both quite a bit. And I've grown to appreciate most things in the discography. Roll the Bones is probably the other least interesting thing they ever put out. I really like how
the rapping.
Well, yeah, that's at least unpredictable. It's not expected. So
who doesn't want Rush to rap?
Maybe in 1991 you can maybe imagine it as like a novelty thing and it's predictable in that context. But outside of it, you know, you're just in a vacuum. You're like, where's this coming from? What the heck? But then you got Counterparts and Test Record I like a lot. Paper Trails is kind of cool. Not my favorite, to be fair, but I really like Snakes and Arrows. Clockwork Angels I'm not as hot on. It is what it is, I guess. And then but the point I'm making is it's a group that remained quite interesting, I think, throughout their time together. But I look through, and the one that I always want to keep coming back to and playing again is actually Grace Under Pressure. I think this is the most interesting album they put out, musically, conceptually, sonically, and it's that beautiful culmination of Cold War era depression, Rush growing up. They're in their 30s at this point, I imagine, or approaching it. It's a time where they kind of feel like they've done all they can with the progressive rock. Having Hemispheres is probably the apotheosis of that. And they've tried a more radio-friendly sound with the spirit of radio, a new wave sort of synthesizer fusion with moving pictures, even more so signals. And they're trying to get the best of both worlds with Grace Under Pressure. And I feel as though they most perfectly incorporated the progressive rock ethos within 4 to 5 minute verse chorus songs on Grace Under Pressure. I really love What's on Signals as well. That's probably my second favourite of the discography. Although I just love the Signals. There's a lot of optimism. I like the pessimism of Grace Under Pressure. I think by the time you get to Between the Wheels, you have one of the most beautifully cogent pathologies on any 1980s rock LP. And to me, it's, I think far and away the most fascinating release they ever put out. I like the Sonics on Power Windows as well, but it's a bit more of the, the contemporary technology, like what Signals is. That despair on Grace Under Pressure. It's like prog rockers who've listened to a bit of this Heat or OMD. It's superlative. I absolutely love it. What they definitely were listening to, according to them, were the groups like The Police and Simple Minds and
new wave music, really, because this album falls into the category of nuclear wave, right? So it's where prog rock, rather than going completely radio rock oriented like Asia or something like that, right? They've taken the sounds of new wave, and sort of incorporated them into their sound. So there are elements of the sound on this album that are kind of like cold wave-esque, and things like that. A bit more so than, say, Power Windows, because this is a bit more stark, and a bit more than Signals, because that one's more like gooey, if that makes sense.
Martin Popoff said it was milled creamy.
Yeah, creamy, yeah. Creamy is a good description of the sound of Signals, whereas this one is cold and stark and sort of spacious and full of guitar reverb and synthesizers and strange Japan-esque drum patterns and things like that,
I think the reason this was the only one that was like that, and my Power Windows was as close to Signals, is because Grace Under Pressure wouldn't have fared as commercially well. It didn't have the same hit singles that even Signals had, and that was not as successful. I don't think anything else as Moving Pictures.
Sure.
I think Power Windows, Big Money, was a bigger single than anything on Grace Under Pressure, and so I think that inspired Grace Under Pressure to be more of an individual dark horse in the discography.
Anyone who's listening, if you haven't seen it, I wouldn't often recommend watching music videos on this show, but watch the music video for Big Money by Rush. Trust me. You want to talk about the appreciation of early CGI and corny MTV era music videos. I don't know how this isn't a classic. This should be more classic than Sledgehammer.
Yeah, Alvy Ray Smith's Dreams coming alive on Power Windows there. No, Big Money music video. But
do you mind if I go on a bit about
Absolutely, I would love you to, yeah.
Yeah, no, this is, I'm not tied to, the how the Rush fandom is tied to the 70s sound in a way where, it's not until recently they seem to have retrospectively adapted to appreciating these 80s albums.
Yeah, and even then, only up to Power Windows is more the acceptable. You know what I mean? The two after that have kind of mixed response, typically.
Sure. Hold Your Fire and Presto.
Yeah.
Yeah, but as someone who's not tied into the fandom of 70s, hard rock, proto-prog metal, hard, the sort of hard rock end of progressive rock.
Yeah.
Which Rush occupies. And they have that fantasy element as well, which they do quite tastefully, I feel, though infamously some of Neil Peart's rhyming couplets are a bit clunky.
Oh yeah.
The general sort of sentiment and imagery of his lyrics are fairly good. And that carries over from the prog era into these more poppy new wave releases Grace Under Pressure, for example. Though unlike most like new wave and pop music, because they still have one foot in that in their tradition. They write these sort of out there songs, at least structurally, and for the most part, because of the technical nature of like say Geddy Lee's bass playing or Alec Lifeson's guitar and Neil Peart's drumming, like they do get a bit like more intricate than pop music technically does.
Mm-hmm.
But I find it interesting how they can sort of meld those two worlds.
Yeah.
And because it like Geddy Lee's not the best synthesizer player in the world. It's supplemental to their music. Somehow the synth parts they come up with are always kind of really interesting. Like they're very basic, but they're droney and sort of and repetitive in a really neat way. It's the sort of way that only someone that's another instrument would come up with.
Mm-hmm.
So this era of Rush does benefit from that quite a lot. And this album in particular, it's just got really good songs. Like, pretty much every song on it is a good song. I wouldn't say there's like one bad song on the album, to be honest. As far as the whole piece goes, like I could point to parts where like Neil Peart has some clunky rhyming couplets or something, but that's sort of irrelevant to the overall picture of what this album's going for, which is a similar, like I think was once described about Signals being like a sort of it's a concept album in just incognito.
Yeah.
And this album is sort of similar.
Yeah.
It captures the paranoid atmosphere of early 80s. Definitely English, but because they're Canadian as well, nuclear apocalypse paranoia coming from a place that's not the two powers that were behind the Cold War, the two main powers, the United States and the USSR. So it's like the Canadian take on like, and it's a unique take on like nuclear paranoia, like things like early signal warning being apparently about how like they have some base for like Americans have an early signal warning base in Canada.
Yeah, the distant early warning. Yeah.
Yeah.
They set it up fairly recently.
Yeah. So they're being sort of like topical and contemporaneous, taking that from the newer generation rather than pointing more toward the mythology. And so it captures the zeitgeist of the time in an interesting way, I feel. And then it has a few songs like harkening back to like the Holocaust and obviously, like you mentioned, Behind the Wheels, which is an one of their best songs, definitely. Yeah. And even like I was ripping on Neil Peart's lyrics, every now and then there's just this little like genius part. Like where the lyric where he's like, "Brother, don't start another war, another wasteland, and another lost generation." That's like perfect, like heavy metal hard rock lyrics.
Yeah.
So you got to really appreciate when he comes up with the goods, which happens every now and then. And so and it's just fascinating how this album and that whole atmosphere of nuclear wave, maybe like I've mentioned previously that I find it fascinating because like I own this album on record, for example. And so many other nuclear wave albums, because there's just all these 80s albums that are being sold at record stores and shit of that era. But I find it interesting how it's still very much relevant within the sphere we live in, with the coming second Cold War, which has already begun, really. And the sort of prevalence of, in the early 80s within the realm of this Cold War stuff, and in the case of the UK, anti-Thatcherite or anti-Reaganite sort of stuff in North America. Like there's this sort of like back then there was similar to the nuclear stuff, there was a paranoia about like information technology, computers on the rise, and privacy and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Which has only become more prevalent as well.
Oh yeah.
And so this album sort of, and nuclear wave in general, like it is somehow weirdly timeless. Like that they were almost like people considered sort of irrational at the time, I feel, but they were the sane ones in their generation. The people in the 80s who weren't being along the lines of like it's A-OK. Like I'll get to soon, things like the PMRC and stuff like that. these sort of wings of culture that wanted to, because I think the 80s is when like the televangelists and stuff like that really took off.
Yeah, I believe so.
In America, and I'm sure Rush have a few songs about that.
I believe so.
And how these sort of like elements of like it's A-OK sort of culture permeated when and considered people who were paranoid of like nuclear, weapons and the Cold War in general were considered a bit irrational, and like they're wearing their hearts on the sleeve a bit too much. But it seems that in many ways, like they were right. Like really, we've only delayed the inevitable. Like it's still very much an all-encompassing part of our lives. And so like a lot of these records are trying to say, like you mentioned This Heat or various other British acts from the time, or even like this band we're into, Rush were like clearly inspired by like the Police and stuff like that, with a lot of the sonics like reverb scapes on this album and the sort of ska-esque like rhythmic strumming and stuff and synth work, which is kind of really, they take the organ sound of ska music or reggae and turn it into like siren sounds, dystopian synth sirens. Which is how this album is so genius. It's got all little things like that. So like, it really is a sort of all encapsulating, it's extrapolated from the zeitgeist of its time.
Yeah.
And I feel that's the sort of zeitgeist that is still very relevant now. Like this album is as fresh as it was back then. Like, honestly, if you don't look at it superficially.
Yeah, it makes you think of Irradiated Sands. And, I was thinking that this I was going to suggest that this record I think partly the a lasting appeal could be the it's a very, I don't know if this is a direction that 80s production took very often. Like it's a very kind of slim sound. It's not a wall of sound, but it's very all the instruments are very precise. I just think it's a very distinct artifact sonically as well.
Yeah, definitely.
And also, I guess I wanted to point out how, I guess I just wanted to go through the songs a bit briefly. Like, Distant Early Warning actually might be the weaker song on here. I just think the chorus is a bit tacky, frankly.
The chorus is probably what will turn most people off the album.
Exactly.
Upon first listening to it.
After Image is better, but I might be the second weakest track on here. And then Red Sector A is awesome. Enemy Within is a bit... the lyrics can be a bit corny, actually. Maybe that's another weaker track, potentially. But yeah, I guess the instrumentation is quite strong. Body Electric, it might be an awkward chorus for some, but I just love it. It's like probably my favorite, other than the last track, my favorite track on here. I think it's a lot of fun. And the verses are brilliant, I say. And Kid Gloves is an awesome instrumental, but yeah, the lyrics are corny. Red Lens is one of the best tracks they ever put out, I think. And then, yeah, Between the Wheels is superlative, I would say. Yeah, just a incredibly interesting release from this group. My favorite album that they ever put out. I'm very fond of just the variety and the creative ambitions which Rush made evidence of all throughout their recording career. Yeah, and I'm a fan. I really dig their work.
I just want to rip on Spirit of the Radio briefly.
Sure.
Like you said, the chorus of Distant Early Warning being a bit of a turn off. How about Spirit of the Radio? Man, like I hope I piss off a few Rush fans if they like that song. Cause
I'm not a big fan, yeah.
That song, man, that's a bad song. But yeah, no, Grace Under Pressure, great album. Which doesn't have Spirit of the Radio. That's on Permanent Waves.
Yeah.
A weird sort of outlier. Though their fans seem to appreciate.
Yeah, it's a loved one in the fan base, but it's not one of my favourites in the discography, sadly.
Yeah, it feels a bit cynical to my mind. Like, Rush as a band who seem to be brimming with creativity seem to have consciously chosen to, like, go for a radio audience with that album.
There's a couple great tracks on there, like Natural Science and Jacob's Ladder are really good.
Sure. I guess I'm talking about more the singles.
Oh, yeah, sure, fair enough.
But yeah, no, Grace Under Pressure. Check it out.
Check out this next one, too.
Oh, man, the next one. I guess I'll get started?
Yeah.
Oh, man, Negative Land. Helter Stupid. Now, speaking of Sample Delia Operation Mindfuck, sonic experimentation, culture jamming albums. This might be the prototypical one in a weird way. I guess I first learned about this band because of that documentary.
Yes, Craig Baldwin's Sonic Outlaws. Yes, we
Yeah.
ought to have covered Craig Baldwin before in FODD, AOD. We have not yet. Just briefly here, just so I don't have to later. Craig Baldwin himself takes footage from other media and he creates these alternate histories, these hidden conspiratorial histories about aliens operating in Central America and things like that. His films included it's like Spectres of the Spectrum, I think it was called, from the late 90s. There's one from the late 80s, early 90s, Aliens Under America, and then Sonic Outlaws is a documentary about Negative Land from the mid 90s, and then there's Mock Up a Moo from 2008. All these are brilliant, and of course, but yeah, the Sonic Outlaws is the one of the four, which is not one of these strange composings, weavings of alternate histories via stock footage and footage of other pieces of art and film media. Sonic Outlaws was following a similar kind of artistic ethos outfit, Negative Land. Take it away.
Especially in regards to music, yeah. And the idea of that documentary, I guess it was like documenting their experience with the media and the courts after releasing an album called U2, named after the spy plane, with, the big lettering on the album was U2 and a picture of the plane, and then they had their name under it in small letters, and it was a deliberate experiment in promotion, merchandising, copyright, philosophy, it's sort of it was a provocation of the the mechanisms in the marketing of the music industry. And so like this is a band who I didn't realize till today actually, this album Helter Stupid was released on SST, which was Black Flag's label, because I guess they were from San Francisco, and that made a lot of sense in my mind, because this is definitely downstream of that sort of it makes sense that this was put out on a hardcore punk label, because it's just like I mentioned before, it's culture jamming in the most raw aspect. Like I'm fairly certain I first heard this album without actually knowing the story of it, but it was it's implicit in the narrative of the first song, done through like radio recordings they've taken off and television recordings that they've made of a fake story they generated about teen violence, a teenager who killed their parents with an axe after listening, their religious parents, after listening to a song on one of their earlier albums called Christianity is Stupid. So they circulated this fake story or something like that, and it managed to make it onto local news and local radio stations, and I think it got a bit of national coverage. And they've taken recordings of that story of them planting it's essentially an artistic psyop, right? And then they've woven it into the narrative of this sample Delia album they've created out of it, mixing it in with a bunch of other, sort of like just found sound sort of stuff from television and radio. And it sort of, it comprises this like overall sort of it's a very like sporadic, like schismatic, like sort of sonic landscape, like a lot of this sort of heavy sound collage stuff is, but it's so strange that like as avant-garde as it is, it mixes in like these disco string arrangement sections and stuff, and it's very like heavily musical at the same time. Like when I first heard it, I was amazed. I thought that maybe someone like the Avalanches must have listened to music like this, It just, it screams that sort of, like, hauntological psychedelia. And then, like, that's just it musically. Like, I think it's sort of, like, I know a lot of people who, like, they don't think of this sort of avant-garde stuff as music. They think of it more as, like, an art installation or something. But, like, something like this, I really do hear the music in it. and then it'll mix it in with this sort of like political and artistic creative philosophy as well, and commentary on, various contemporary sort of things that I just feel we haven't moved on from as a culture since the culture jamming era. Like, these things have only become more relevant, and these people back then were trying to sort of push them into the forefront, and they've sort of gotten lost in various worlds of like bipartisan politics and culture wars and things like that. But like they're speaking to a more sort of universal thing. Like, for example, on this album, it's stuff like commercialism and sort of like religious fervor, censorship. A weird thing is, like, people always talk about it as a circumstance of the internet, and like I said earlier, things like hauntology and various like digital philosophies have this notion that nostalgia is like a new thing within consumer culture, that nostalgia is like the paradigm of the day, and that we don't live in new creative worlds because nostalgia's just bogged us down.
Yeah.
But then this album has samples of radio channels in the 80s playing a whole day of 70s radio, and they're like, this is legitimate 70s radio, remember the good times, we'll play it at this hour, get your stereophonic 70s speakers working, because it'll be in legit stereophonic 70s sound. And so it's like, it's even like that vinyl appreciation thing, but it's back then trying to get that through the radio. And it's just, it's so relevant to where we are right now that I think these analog sort of culture jamming and engineering experiments have sort of, like I said earlier, I feel people have sort of misappropriated the idea that this started with the internet. Whereas, like, it's just gotten amplified with the internet.
Yeah.
The underlying thing was there back then. It was even maybe more dangerous back then.
Yeah.
Because we didn't have the internet to regulate, sort of more antisocial behaviors and things like that, because of the internet, you're not going to have a Salem sort of, or like a West Memphis 3 situation again, things like that. In, say, for example, America, you're not going to have these preposterous, like, Metallica getting sued and things like that. Whereas in the analog world, it was way more, because of the communication wasn't up there, like, it was way more dangerous, I feel. And so, I don't know, I just find it fascinating. Like, this album makes me think about that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Like, it reminds me of when I first read Hunter S. Thompson, and I realized all this culture war stuff has been around since the late 60s, or even earlier, It's nothing new. It's better to sort of understand where it's come from, rather than partake in, And this album is a good, like, legitimate remedy for that. Like, I once described OK Computer by Radiohead as being not, like, alleviating to the sort of thematic elements of that album, being isolation within a technological world, like Fight Club sort of stuff, right? But that album just, like, sort of points to that in, like adolescent pop punk terms, of like, relate, right? It doesn't alleviate those things, like the way the Fogs would have in the 60s, with their sort of unique message. And I feel that a band like this is similar to that, they've got that, they've got a legitimate idea of how to help the process along and like take culture out of its malaise, and I feel that's a mission statement of this album. And like, other than being a sort of polemic work, it is really interesting music as well, which only makes that more powerful. Like, they're coincided. Like, I feel anyone who sees this sort of like collage music as non-musical, like, maybe at its worst, but at its best, it's like the most music can be, I feel. It's really pushing the envelope. What do you reckon?
I think it's a superb release myself. Negative Land, obviously I found out about Negative Land via Craig Baldwin's Sonic Outlaws documentary, and I've never explored the music as much as I really probably ought to have. This is a really cool album, and, the song that's sampled mostly on that first side is Babu Silvetti's Spring Rain. That was utilised in Season 1, Episode 6 of The Crunchies.
Nice.
Now, none of you understand what that is yet. Maybe you never will, but, it was an interesting world, let's just say that. Now, I also find it interesting that, and this is on the next side, two songs which are later featured in Tarantino films are sampled, Joe Texas' I Gotcha, and the guitar solo of Strawberry Letter 23 by the Brothers Johnson.
Yeah.
I Gotcha was in Reservoir Dogs, Strawberry Letter 23, of course, and Jackie Brown, that's one of the top two best moments of Tarantino in music.
Sure.
Actually, if the best one is the Stuck in the Middle of You, that's the second best.
Oh,
and both involve a violent kind of a juxtaposition, interestingly enough.
Yeah.
And, I think this is really, really good. And, it's interesting, you bring up the similarities with the contemporary internet age, the sort of trolling / meme era that I've been in for some time now. And I think it's sad that I feel like one good thing about the internet is that when this sort of cultural, what would you say, these confusions arise, the internet's good to have all the alternative viewpoints out there.
Yeah.
And you can kind of decipher between who's taking this angle, who's taking another angle. But you also have sometimes I feel like the potential seriousness of political polemic is potentially reduced by the internet's, one, because it's so abstracted from a certain material reality in a sense. You're kind of operating within a bedroom potentially, and on a smartphone at that maybe. And sometimes I feel like it's all for the sake of kind of humor and laughs rather than sort of, like, I think that sometimes it's funnier when the humor makes you... humor as revelation is kind of the most potent humor in a way.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's where the effective satire on Negative Land's Helter Stupid is far more compelling to me than a lot of, say, potential internet era equivalents, whether you're making YouTube compilations or whether you're, posting things on Twitter /X. It's just all like
I did
images.
forget to mention this album's hilarious.
It just feels so like all for the sake of isn't this absurd? Aren't I clever? And that's kind of my problem. I hate to say, if you've seen the recent AOD video on Ruben Ostlund's Triangle of Sadness, I can have this problem of satire where I'm thinking, who's consuming this? Isn't this just for the upper classes to go, society is quite the barrel of monkeys, life's a jungle, life's world's a jungle, and it's just like, nothing changes. These people just kind of laugh and act like they're not part of the problem because they've read the satire.
Sure.
So it can make me feel quite cynical about satire, although given that Negative Land is the kind of thing which a lot of those same audiences living in, Cremorne, Bellevue Hill, Vaucluse would scoff at, I think it's probably doing something right, I suspect.
Hate it.
Yep.
That's why it's doing good.
It's interesting that there are corners of these suburbs where, even playing Nevermind the Bollocks will still upset people. So I always found it interesting that has that potentiality around it.
Destroy.
What is this noise? Oh, I haven't heard this since the 70s. I don't want to hear it now. But, no, seriously. This is really cool. Sometimes I feel like internet culture needs to step up the game. But the internet's a really big place. I'm sure there's clever stuff happening here and there. And the loudest, dumbest stuff gets to the top, as you would happen.
Sure.
It is what it is, man.
It's what it always was.
Exactly, that's very true. And do you want to say anything else about Helter Stupid before we go on to something that is
just
quite knowingly...
Just listen to it because, it's a strange experience.
Anyway...
Whereas the next one, I suppose, is an experience.
It's knowingly and passionately of a certain age demographic, and it's not older than 15 and a half. And look guys, Dio is... I was talking about Dio last Mandala, I think, and I was expressing my appreciation for this stuff in a sort of... Look, there is a sort of qualification here, frankly. Like, I like this stuff because it is kind of adolescent, like the Maiden stuff, but less sophisticated, both musically and in terms of subject matter and musical ambitions, production, ethos. But the Dio stuff is very, very sword and sorcery, very, what's the word I use? Pizza sauce. Very adolescent and kind of, Conan the Barbarian. Holy Diver, the debut, is probably the most effective thing in the Dio discography, and I think people will admit, like, oh yeah, well, that's a good album. Last in Line is kind of good, that's the next one, but it's not as good, I feel. That's a lot of people's opinion. Sacred Heart's a bit more commercial and not interesting. Dream Evil is quite solid. I think of those 480s ones, that's the second most solid. I know Martin Popoff mentioned the McLuhan of heavy metal again. He says, oh, Dream Evil's easily the best one. Like, it's just obvious to me. It's pretty consistent, but the highs on Holy Dive are like, the title track, Straight Through the Heart, Shame on the Night, and what's that other one I like on there? Not whatever. There's just more memorable tracks on there, and plus Vivian Campbell's one of the few guitarists whose solos I can remember once they're over. Like, I can remember how the solo to Straight Through the Heart goes at the end. Do 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 do. Like, I just remember them quite vividly, which is someone, I think it was on one of these Sea Tranquility channels, someone pointed out, oh, you can remember Vivian Campbell's solos, and I was like, oh yeah, I can, holy shit. Maybe I've heard them enough, but I've heard some of these other ones. I've heard I listened to Dream Evil a fair bit in year 10, and I can't say I remember Craig Goldie's solos as well, but they're good songs. Sunset Superman's really good. Album 5, it's Lock Up the Wolves. Okay, totally new lineup here. This guitarist is, I think he's 17 years old, a Northern Irish guy named Rowan Robertson. Dio likes his Northern Irish guitarists. That's who Vivian Campbell was, obviously. And John Sykes, who was in Tigers of Pantang, a Northern Irish group, was considered for Holy Diver, and he wound up being on the last Thin Lizzy album, and then he was the Whitesnake guitarist in 87, and now he's gone missing, apparently now.
Whoa.
Well, that's a Sea of Tranquility joke. He's kind of gone on hiatus, and he's got music. He had made an album, but he doesn't want to release it because he thinks no one cares anymore.
Nice.
But, like, I don't know, like...
You might be right.
Look, if he just puts it out there, like, some people will buy it. Like,
yeah. Fans from back in the day would care.
Yeah, like, just judging by the amount of people on that SOT channel, like, they'll buy it. They got a lot of subs. I don't know. If Pete Pardo promotes it, they'll buy it.
Sure.
That's something, right? But anyway, I guess... Okay, so Lock Up the Wolves. I won't get into the rest of the discography for now. The one I listen to the most, I guess, Holy Dive is the one that's the most quality, but I keep coming back to Lock Up the Wolves because I think, like Peace of Mind, it's a good composite of the Dio discography, both the up-tempo stuff of the 80s, the kind of corny, chorusy stuff of the 80s, the anthemic material, and the slower, more depressing, morbid stuff of the 90s. It's both it's 50-50 up-tempo and more what Popoff calls slow Dio, quite derisively. Although I think I really like, no disrespect to Dio himself, but I think my favourite parts of this album are, I really like the band he got together here, when they're just soloing, when it's just the instrumentaling. This is like good punk metal. And I think the reason I say that is because I've heard Dio fans complain that, oh, the band's scattered, it's all drummers, it's all over the place, and blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, it's metal as fuck. Good. I like the vague sloppiness of what people say is vague sloppiness about some... I've just heard some criticisms of this album on like those YouTube channels, and fair enough, but that's just why I think I like some of the stuff on here.
Yeah.
As more of a punk fan than a metal fan, certainly, to be quite honest.
Sure.
Yeah, like, I think... Like, I know there's probably only, like, 5 proper good songs on here in a way. I like Night Music, the title track's really good, Lock Up the Wolves, and there's a track, there's 3 in a row that are good. Twisted, Walk on Water, and Why Are They Watching Me? Those are cool as.
Sure.
There's 3 in a row there, but just like, yeah, this is, like, as consistent as a Dio record gets in a way.
Toward the end there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But other than that, like, Popoff singles out like Evil on Queen Street as being a bad example of slow Dio. I kind of agree. And then there's like cheesy chorusy stuff like that could have been from Sacred Heart, like Hey Angel. Born on the Sun's okay, that's the second track. Like the point is, I think it's a really ideal cross section of what Dio's all about, both the good and the bad. And as for the 90s stuff, he goes back to Sabbath and Dehumanizer, which is a really good release actually. And then the Dio band puts out with guitarist Tracy G. Yeah. Strange Highways Angry Machines. I like both of those. Strange Highways is like sequel to Dehumanizer. It's pretty good actually. And then there was a ill-conceived, ill-thought-out concept album called Magica, and I'll bring up Pop Off again. He once joked before that album came out, we all thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if Dio did like this operatic kind of narrative concept album? Well, you got it, and it's the worst thing in the discography. No one really likes it, sadly. It's too much.
Magica,
yeah. Craig Goldie from Dream Evil returned on guitars for that one, and then Killing the Dragon's more of a back to basics 80s album from 2002 with Doug Aldrich on guitar. Pretty good for what it is. Master of the Moon, Craig Goldie came back. That's 2004, and that's the last Dio studio album. It's likable if you know what to expect, I guess. And then the last Dio project would be the Mob Rules era lineup of Sabbath, which is to say, and Dehumanizer, so which is to say, Dio, Tony and Geezer, and Vinny Appice, rather than Bill Ward, who's on Heaven and Hell. And they were in a group called Heaven and Hell, and they released an album, they toured, and they released an album called The Devil You Know, which I used to kind of like in late high school, but I remember the production being a bit too kind of modern and like loud and CD era for me. But like, I might like it more now. I can't have, strangely, I just have not gone back to listen to it for a long time, but I really ought to, because people really like that album, I know. And yeah, so I have a soft spot for Dio, although I don't have the capacity to defend him too much from maybe not like kind of spiteful criticism, but I would maybe get my back up a bit and be like, oh come on, like what's get pull the rod out of your ass, like it's just is what it is. It's like it's just Robert Howard Conan stories or silly pulp. It's just like comic book splatter nonsense. But in terms of like defending Dio from kind of humorous mockery, that's gonna be a task I'm not up to. That's all I'll say, and I'll step away from the microphone just so I don't have to talk about Dio for too much longer.
Well, I guess unfortunately Dio lends himself a bit too much to the mockery. He sort of like leans into it the way like the one kid in high school who like asks to be bullied does. Like no one deserves to be bullied.
No.
However, there's always that one kid from your school who like thinks that being provocative means just like pissing people off. So,
yeah.
So they do get bullied.
You're thinking you're the kid, like it's good to be yourself, but like, stop.
Yeah.
Like, sorry to say this, but just stop.
And I suppose Dio falls a bit into that territory, but like if you're a Dio fan, you can maybe appreciate him for that in the way of being like, supportive. But
we're just like weirdly shameless about it, I guess.
Yeah. Like I guess the biggest criticism, me personally, I'd have of Dio is just that like I was making fun of Neil Peart's rhyming couplets before.
Yeah.
But Dio can be a bit basic and like tasteless.
Oh
in
yeah,
that sense.
very high school. Yeah,
but that's his like shtick. So if you knowingly know the Dio shtick, then it's fine, and especially sometimes it does work quite well. But yeah, as far as this album goes, it's a sort of like I wouldn't typically listen to it as an album. There's a few songs on there that if you like pulled out, or if you put on like a heavy metal playlist, like it'd be seamless. Like they're really good, well written, and interesting metal songs, and they'd hit all the standards that makes metal like interesting viscerally, And Dio maybe I can appreciate it because it's the one metal sort of music which doesn't need to be taxonomically categorized through an anthropological lens.
Yeah, it's just it is just basic heavy metal, right?
Yeah, like that documentary, The Evolution of
Sam
Metal.
Dunn, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't need that sort of dissection of metal as like a. It's implicit, You don't need a 4-hour documentary saying that, or longer, saying that the metal appeals to the rebellious aspect of like one's psyche, and because it's visceral, it's an exorcism in like negative energy into positive energy. Like that's just kind of implicit. Like it doesn't need a documentation of it in my mind.
Yeah.
And so this album, it falls into that world, like, of just like you were saying, tomato sauce or like pizza sauce, of just like fundamental rock music. Like it doesn't. It's still. It's 1990, right?
Yeah.
But it's still very much an 80s album, an 80s idea of like heavy metal in the post bluesy Sabbath sort of, you know, like what's the first Dio Sabbath album?
Oh, that's Heaven and Hell in 80, yeah.
Yeah, which is like, goes that one step beyond Back in Black or something like that, which is still in the hard rock blues realm.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
That 1980 Sabbath album with Dio on it is like taking one foot from the new wave of British heavy metal, the punk inspired sort of metal, and so but still very much conforming to like the barroom hard rock staples of like arena hard rock that's post like Kashmir or Immigrant Song.
Yeah.
Like that's most of Slow Dio is taking off Kashmir and Immigrant Song, that sort of thumping bass, and so yeah, if you're looking for an album in that realm, this album does definitely suit that. For me personally, the songs would fit better just as a sort of compilation experience, you know, within the realm of other metal.
Yeah.
But I personally can enjoy it, especially as a fan of like Iron Maiden and Peace of Mind. And like you said, the guitarist on this album was like 17 or something. He must have been a Peace of Mind fan or a Maiden fan, because he brings those sort of touches, interesting sort of licks as well, especially for like he'll just have these strange overdriven guitar licks. So that makes this album fairly unique. It might not be as good as that Aussie album with that young guitarist. What's that one?
Oh, which
from the like mid to late 80s.
Oh, that's what's it called? The Ultimate Sin with Jakey Lee.
This album kind of reminds me of that in a weird way. It's like Dio's version of that, working with like a sort of younger guitarist who has a fresh take on the metal they invented essentially. And so it's interesting as an artifact like that. And if you can get over the hurdle of like the sort of Dio-isms, you know, like when that one acoustic song, you know, the song that has the electric like plucking, and I just keep picturing, like, I was waiting for him to go, "In the misty mountain," or "Morning," or whatever the lyric is. It's just like, so much of like Dio's music does just fall into that.
Yeah.
But a fan would enjoy it. Someone who likes heavy metal would like it. Listening to this album reminded me of hanging out with like one of my old friends, Sean, who just loved metal.
Yeah.
So I liked it for that reason.
Awesome.
And if you're not too uptight about music, then you'd find something to like about it, you know.
Fuck yeah, I think that's all that really needs to be said about Dio and Lock Up the Wolves. I'm very happy with that.
It's very good.
Yeah, I enjoy it, and I'm happy to have that on record. As in, you know, here, not on. We don't have it on LP or CD.
No, I got a reel-to-reel going. It's like Nixon's Oval Office.
Fantastic. Yeah, it was weird that they not only recorded everything on tape, but they were filming everything, and they released it in 1989 as a television film. I don't know. Yeah, they just had cameras everywhere, apparently.
They had their day.
Yeah. Anyway, I think we're going to be moving on now to very interesting. One of two men who Nick Kent claimed all British music was downstream of, and maybe people like Fisher would have a problem with this statement. I think it was Nick Kent who said that all of British music was downstream of Syd Barrett and Kevin Ayers.
Definitely. Well, I was thinking about, while listening to this album recently, actually, Kevin Ayers might have invented yacht rock, so there is
his
that.
later 70s albums are a bit closer to that soft rock world.
And I could imagine,
And you sample bits of them, and like the 80s stuff, it's not as idiosyncratic, let's just say that.
No, because his early stuff is fairly idiosyncratic.
Fairly.
Fairly. The first album is a bit more conventional in its songwriting, but
Joy of a Toy.
Joy of a Toy, yeah. But
I like that a lot. That's like
it's
adjacent
definitely
to soft machine stuff.
And it's got one foot in that sort of soft machine, like jazz rock roll.
Yeah.
And also psychedelia. and like circus music or whatever, you know, it's got a unique thing going on. But then the album after that, the next two, Shoots at the Moon and Whatever She Brings We Sing, like go into weird avant-garde territory. Whereas this album, I guess he like pulled back a bit to write more like traditional songs. But at the same time, it's still filled with touches of that, yeah, like out there Canterbury world of jazz rock, like fusion music, along with like, like I was saying earlier about Nexus Point albums. I feel this album's a weird nexus point of, like you said earlier, like, oh sorry, Nick Kent said, like British music was downstream of Kevin Ayers. Like this album, like it's interesting that there was that record with him and like Eno and who was it, John Cale
and Nico.
And Nico, yeah, because this album is like, it's that world of like New York art rock, like Lou Reed, John Cale, right? But also British Canterbury, in the strange European like sort of Nico world. As well as like there's a song on this album called Hymn toward the end, and I'm like, man, this is like the first Brian Eno pop song. Like, you know, all the Brian Eno sort of strange like space agey type pop songs.
Cindy Tells Me sort of.
Yeah, it's very much like that song. And this album's just like a weird nexus point of art pop and art rock. Like, it's strange that Kevin Ayers seems to have been neglected in the music consciousness, because where like things like The Velvet Underground and Brian Eno have persisted. Because like I listen to an album like this and I just see all those worlds colliding in such a natural way, but also in such a, like, while all those sonic movements like somehow coalesce in an album like this, I feel it's also tied into some person's like idiosyncratic songwriting and vision, similar to Syd Barrett, where it's just sort of like lackadaisical, proto-slacker, like would rather than, I think he only recorded albums like the ones you were talking about in the late 70s to make a bit of money to like fund his lifestyle of sitting by the beach in India and drinking like malt wine or something.
As one does.
So there's that weird like lackadaisical, like tropical, I'm just gonna lie down on the Indian coast and drink wine sort of attitude to his creative process and the music itself. That, like,
it's very
I said,
Edwardian.
Yeah, and it reminds me of like that yacht rock sort of 70s lifestyle, but done from an earlier like hippie perspective.
Yeah.
And this album just sort of encapsulates that world of like where 60s hippie psychedelia meets 70s art pop. And sort of, it's like the bridge between those two movements in a weird way. And it's just filled with like interesting, amazing songs. Like, there's a song called like Decadence, which was mentioning like the desert, the desert shore. And I'm like, and I looked it up, and apparently the song was about Nico. And I'm like, oh wow, there's a weird contemporary to this day reference to like Nico. But I guess like he was a part of that whole world, and yeah, it's just if anyone out there is like a fan of like Robert Wyatt or John Cale, Lou Reed, Brian Eno, I guess I just don't see why Kevin Ayers isn't also in that conversation.
Maybe because what we could be probably definitely perceived as the downward spiral of the recording oeuvre.
Sure.
But I think to some degree in the UK, at least from older folks, he's remembered as a kind of this major giant. But it's interesting how
typically
in that 74 live album,
especially being part of Soft Machine as well.
Yeah. That 74 live album, Kevin Ayers, Eno, John Cale and Nico. At the time, Kevin Ayers was the biggest name of those four.
Yeah.
Now, Kevin Ayers is almost forgotten. He's almost the most well-known as, was he on this first Soft Machine album? Like, it's weird, he has been a bit neglected, seemingly. Like, I wasn't as aware of him as this Syd Barrett kind of disciple until the 2020s. You know, I remember listening to a bunch of I listened to Joy of a Toy back in 2014 or so when I got into like Soft Machine. I really, really liked it. Still do. And but yeah, I didn't really listen to this set of three. This is kind of the third of. There's another album here which I don't think I'm familiar with. This Nurse's Song of Elephants. I don't know if I've heard that. But yeah, Shooting at the Moon. Whatever she brings, we sing, and Banana More. The third of this is kind of something of a set here. Really, really strong and interesting, and it is. It's kind of God, like I wonder if there's this weird nexus where this stuff is a bit like it's gorgeously of its day, but I think there's this vague despair wherein I think where some people would brush this sort of stuff off was they would say, oh, it's of its time, it's naive, like the Happy Mondays thing maybe. It's like, oh, it's this kind of moment of vaguer, more prosperous, sort of optimistic times, and nowadays it's sort of in the clouds or whatever. But I don't know, there is something to glean from the optimism, and it's also sometimes a bit too easy to assume that things were super easy at certain points in history. I don't think things were that easy in the UK in the early 70s, maybe for someone of Kevin Ayre's material economic disposition, but nevertheless, it's indicative of a certain ethos of sonic composition, which was, I think, prophetic for that 90s and 2000s neo-psych lo-fi movement. These singer-songwriters, in the songwriter-driven work of Mercury Rev, at least on Deserter Songs, or the wannabes of the Flaming Lips.
Yeah, he's the original slacker in a way.
And we were talking about Jeremy Harmer in that respect too, I think.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, he's of that era, of course. Now, I big fan of Banana More. He's a really fascinating artist, and the variety on here, the creativity, it's worth a comparison to the likes of Roxy Music in a way as well. Contemporaneous to the kind of glam rock deconstruction and sort of brilliant restitching of rock and roll pop music in the really both modernist and traditionalist way, kind of seamlessly. T-Rex or Bowie with Mick Ronson. This is the same year as Aladdin Sane. You can always compare it to something like that.
Sure.
But the variety in Aladdin Sane of mainly American styles, but that's a masterpiece. But Animal's fairly worthy of that sort of environment, that ecosystem. I'm endorsing it for sure.
Oh, it's got the funniest ending to an album as well. She's like, you're not happy, you're just stoned. And this orchestra swells up.
So you got to consider that as part of that there is a sort of vague, cynicism about kind of cheeky cynicism about this. It's self-awareness of we are.
It's mischievous.
Yeah. Acknowledging the obvious elephant in the room that people throw at this sort of world,
And I feel that's the theme that all the things I've chosen today sort of conform to. They're all weirdly mischievous in a way. In their own special way.
Yeah, for sure.
And definitely. This album is it's both earnest and sardonic at the same time.
Absolutely.
And that's that sort of style of songwriting I kind of just adore. It's so brimming with ideas when you can do things like that, And there's plenty of examples people can point to throughout music history, but yeah, like Eno, for example, Morrissey, a million more, but yeah, Kevin Ayers has his very own sort of unique take on that. And just as the originator of the slacker ethos, I gotta give him 2 thumbs up. 4 thumbs up, actually, for both Siskel and Andy. But
gotta appreciate Ayers. And now I think we're going to be moving on to heavier music in the current present day. Well, we did that on a couple of instances last show, actually. I did King Buffalo and Belgium's Absent in Body. And now we're going to be moving to normally kind of a stoner rock group. This is Australia's, Melbourne's King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. Very well known now internationally. Very beloved both domestically.
From Perth for some reason.
That's Tame Impala.
Yeah, I thought they fell into the Tame Impala,
right.
pond world of Australian psych rock, but Melbourne, okay, yeah, sorry, please continue.
Yeah, and, they've been putting out, I think it's 26 albums since 2010 or 2012 or something. Yeah. One of these very contemporary, prolific acts. I think they just, they play a lot, they jam a lot, they indulge in a lot of extracurricular psychoactive activities.
They hang out with Healthy Harold, let's say.
And, you know, they've been putting out albums for so long. I've listened to them here and there, and they're pretty cool. And this one got a lot of attention in particular.
Yeah.
I could not listen to it with that beautiful illustration, the cover art. And so I play it, and, you know, like, this is everything I've ever really wanted from this band. Well, I always expected, I am partial to the stoner metal, stoner rock sound. This is more of a, like, progressive Maiden-inspired thrash album.
Yeah, with stoner metal vocals.
Yes, good point. Reminds me of what I loved about like some of the Mastodon Leviathan stuff from like the early that album from the early 2000s. It's all the lyrical imagery. It's so deliciously Australian in its fantasies. God, like it's like a contemporary, more like traditional metal analog to that beautifully kind of passionately Australian vibe of Cybertron's music, like the first two albums they put out in the late 70s. It's one of those, you know, it's got the vibes of Feed Time and Severed Heads. There's that great Australian sort of more fantasy inclined genre music, which is kind of abrasive and edgy and interesting and exciting. I think this is when King Gizzard are really kind of falling into that. I think before they were cool, but they also fell into sort of a fairly typical but very likable stoner epoch, which, you know, a lot of us are very familiar with. And it was all well and nice and cool, but
Never done drugs.
but enjoyably predictable, let's say. And this one isn't full of surprises for the most part, although it's fulfilling these expected paradigms with such a excitement and such a vigor that I can't help but think that it's one of the more fun albums I've listened to in the 2020s. I've never been more motivated to listen to their music, or at least I suppose one of their set of recordings. And with this one, it's the kind of thing I would have adored in my mid or late adolescence, as I was saying about Absent in Body and King Buffalo last week. Nothing but praise for this album, and I would also like to single out, whilst the first 7 tracks are great, the 8th track you will not be able to find on the Bandcamp or on a CD, on the website, wherever it's streaming. It's actual. You'll find it uploaded to the internet, but it's intended to be a vinyl exclusive. The Dawn of Eternal Night is a spoken word track about a pet Gila lizard who is winds up in initially a telepathic, seemingly conversation with the cat, whose name is Beowulf, as the owners of the house and then their 2 pets are kind of conducting rituals in the center of the home, and the lizard is beset by some, I don't know if you want to call it a curse, because the lizard seems to enjoy it. He grows to a large size, he consumes everyone, including Beowulf, within the home, and then he goes on to enable the apocalypse and the dawn of eternal night as the dragon of Revelation, of the Book of Revelation, of the sort of, you know, it's one of the most magnificently kind of pubescently imaginative pieces of fiction in the history of English language music. Maybe I really adore it, and I think it's the most compelling piece on here, and I appreciate that the guys do something for vinyl exclusive, although I have to admit, like, this is not the album I don't think of this as a vinyl album, partially because it's a contemporary release, partly because it seems more like something that would have been released on CD in the 90s or 2000s, partly because it's the kind of thing that I can imagine me and some other people, some peers, you know, smoking in the forest or in a park at night too. And so, like, the idea of listening to this on a vinyl seems alien to me, and maybe this is maybe subjective, but it seems a bit reductionist to have to go to some room in some house of a record player to, like, get the full experience of this. Like, it doesn't seem like that sort of... I guess I'm more attuned to a world where the music was just be able to pull from the internet at wherever there was a computer in the house or a speaker attached digitally to it. So that world I'm not as with the vinyl. Like, I mean, I've listened to music on records on occasion, and a lot of music is done even via digitally in the bedroom or at home in general. But, like, yeah, there was something... Yeah, it was weird for me to try to associate this with, like, something you had to listen to just sitting next to the record player or whatever. Like, that's a bit slightly insular, even though I'm far from a social person, but to me this seems like an album that's maybe even best going on an adventure, and you need Dawn of Eternal Night when you're sessioning out there, when you can't bring a record player with you. So, I would implore the guys, this, I love the idea of the vinyl exclusive, but for the official Punch, like, I reckon that should have been on there for everyone to enjoy. But obviously they can, people have uploaded it to the internet, or, you put YouTube playlists together with it all attached. But, so yeah, theoretically it's not going to be a problem. We all know how to place files or get internet remote places, so it's not a problem. Yeah, very, very fulfilling. It's a more classy pizza sauce though. This is like, or like a really, really good, like, like a pulp magazine with artists from like a very refined, graphic visual artist, let's say. It's just tons of fun, and it makes me feel validated to be a, late 20s person still listening to music that was probably made for 17-year-olds, but these guys are in their early 30s. They're doing a fantastic job of it. They're very successful in life, seemingly. And it's one of these groups which seem like there would be a hell of a lot of fun to hang out with, whether it be smoking, or whether it be going on a kind of a, internal, psych adventure. Like there's lots of feelings of joy and enthusiasm which emanate from this record, and I always thought the group had the potential to be this, but were maybe trying a bit too hard, or the records were kind of so much of one thing that it was kind of like a sugar rush of sorts. But this is a perfectly defined and very, very considered and energized concept. Totally on board with all of the hype, and I'll be listening to this several times in the future, that I'm fairly sure of, and I'll hand it over now.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a very tasteful, very tasteful permutation of like you said, the sort of three of the main forms of non-experimental but vaguely extreme metal, which is thrash, stoner, and I suppose stoner doom, and maybe a bit of power metal.
Prog metal, maybe.
Prog metal, yeah. Prog metal is metal fun. So the more the less extreme forms of extreme metal.
Yeah.
And so I, while listening to this, I found it really refreshing, sort of hearing a sort of psych rock group's take on that, sort of doing it within interesting but restrained parameters.
Yeah.
It and it doesn't sort of, it has that visceral aspect of the Iron Maiden or the Dio, but it's also doing it with sort of outlandish sonic spaces, For example, the it's almost like Feed Time-esque in its repetitive nature.
Yeah.
It's just this constant hypnotic sort of chugging. Which I suppose is also a bit stoner doomy. But yeah, it's able to mix you can tell it's sort of done by a psych rock group that is sort of considered they're proud, interesting, creative music snobs, in the sort of, people talk about modern groups being curators, or just sort of reinterpreting old forms of music, music snobs or something.
Yeah.
Sort of just taking the narrative of old forms. But it feels like that sort of modern, it just shows you how this sort of postmodern interpretation of 20th century music can make it better than 20th century music.
Yeah, exactly.
While still restraining itself to those parameters, not trying to get too out there or into the realm of vibes or something like
exactly.
that, It's sort of, it's sticking to the modus operandi of Dio, but doing it in such a postmodern way that it's just you can tell it's creative. It's they're not doing it just out of curation, they're doing it out of love and adoration, and that sort of just is all throughout this album. It just it's refreshing to hear like this sort of take on metal, you know, and it's not like too overly like technical either.
Nah,
It's not trying to be like a technical experiment like some types of like metal go into.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
metal, you know. It's trying to make it interesting songs and sonic landscapes. You know? And it's just refreshing to have an album like this nominated or win an ARIA award. Like, this has got to be the best ARIA award winner in the last however long.
God almighty, it must be.
You know, so it's significant that, like, a group like that can at least get, like, mainstream recognition in Australia.
Yeah, it's quite mainstream, yeah.
But they do have an international fan base, but it speaks to the quality of this band, I think. The sort of appreciation they've been able to garner. It's it's fairly admirable, and it's an interesting album. And yeah, like I was saying, kind of along the lines of the curation music snobbery, I guess people would accuse groups of that for like being so prolific these days. But me personally, I think that's a good thing. Like I think that just sort of progresses the creative the creative action of music beyond what we knew in the vinyl era, like you were saying before with vinyl records or whatever, being sort of limiting in a way, which is true. It's a sort of archaic relic of a time before music was so portable. But sort of because of how like you were saying Jeremy Harmer or something like that, you know, this sort of the obscurity of like vinyl records that, you know, sort of they've been given a second life within the internet, and groups like this have then been able to take that and reinterpret it in like a way that is unique to now. That something like the Happy Mondays, the KLF, or Negative Land could only like dream of back then. And that's why I was appreciating those groups so much, is because they were like right on the cusp of the potentiality of where we are right now, you know.
Yes.
And so King Gizzard are a good example of that, I feel. And this is a good album, especially if you just like heavy metal and none of what I just said, you know. You'll like this album. Though what I just said I think does apply as well. Which is a mark of quality in my mind.
Absolutely. And I also want to mention, I adore how it makes heavy metal was, you know, rock music in general and speed, all this, this stuff didn't originate in Australia, it originated in the United States and Europe. But it feels so seamlessly, so unquestionably Australian. It's like they've made the genres their own in such a seemingly effortless way. And it's as though the genres were invented in the country, you would think. You know what I mean?
Sure.
This is like one of the most beautifully Australian pieces of rock, distinctly Australian rock ever released and recorded. And, you know, just like the weird, like kind of almost didgeridoo-esque drones permutating throughout some of the production. God, it's just gorgeous. God, it's like this Mad Max sort of bits of... just evoking kind of Cybertron 76. I don't know. I'm sure they know about that. You don't have to feed time. Just all the cool, uniquely Australian genre fiction, prehistoric monsters. God, it's fucking exciting, and it just makes me proud to be and happy to be alive. Like some of the highest praise I can give to a record, regardless of its you know contribution to a fucking. You know, whiteboard of ideas, you know what I mean? It takes some of them and puts them in a particular corner where it's just like, let's hang out here for a while or forever, you know, can we? No. But, I mean, hey, you know, I can't wait to listen to this when I'm hanging out in the ceiling, you know, one day.
Nice.
Near future. I haven't done that yet, and I'd like to. So it sounds exhilarating. And now, I guess we'll move on to music that was composed by people who were
Speaking
on
of
the
hanging
ceiling,
on the ceiling,
and they were kind of busting through the ceiling, getting onto the roof, and then we had to kind of get helicopters to take them
Far
away
out.
from the clouds.
You want to talk about breaking the threshold of the ceiling? Holy shit, man! Roky Erickson, what a figure. Yeah. Where do you start with the 13th floor elevators? Huh? I suppose you start with the first album.
Yes, you do.
Sounds of the 13th floor elevators.
The American 60s psych album, possibly.
Yeah, it's
like,
great.
it's dense. It's everything that you kind of really are hoping to expect to hear on one of these albums in a cliche sense, but it's so gorgeous, and you can't really call it cliche because when you hear it, you kind of understand why this was such a revolution and why people kind of bemoaned the aesthetic of that 60s counterculture psych moment as becoming kind of banal, kind of
The
commodified in
people.
the 70s, like this is the kind of the source of why it was exciting, I feel.
Mm.
And
then-
also it's telling that it's not as commercial as some of the other stuff from that time, right? You don't hear this on the radio by any means.
It comes from the Texan desert. And then you go into this album next, the Easter Everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
which for some reason I've just, as far as the 13th floor elevators go, I've always gravitated to this album for some weird reason. There's just something about this album that, like I keep saying, permutates, but this permutates like the entire philosophy and less than that actually, the entire being, the entire existence of that 60s revelation, this sort of idea of like transcending material form through a sort of psychic appreciation of what it is to be human itself, a sort of thing that's been lost within the taxonomical nature of how we sort of view the human psyche these days, This album sort of just, even though it was written and composed by people who were completely off their head, and eventually Roky Erickson went on to sort of have his own mental troubles or whatever, which is understandable when you sort of, because of the veracity and the sort of fervorousness of the message he's trying to get across, clearly at the height of his psychedelic experience on this sort of album. Like, the album itself is just like full of these like sort of out there weird like mescaline-esque, desert jams with like strange, it's like garage rock that comes from a mescaline trip in the desert, is the best way to describe the sort of rollicking songs on this album. They're just all filled with weird like production choices that take the limitations of 60s studios, especially like fairly inexpensive ones, similar to the first album, but done in a different way on this album, and sort of elaborates on them in ways that like they're like to the, if you're just listening to like normal, especially 60s rock music, seem like very out there, but then by the time like things like punk came around, it felt very natural. And so, but more post-punk, like an album like this reminds me of like Magazine for some reason, more than anything else. Similar sort of like avant-garde sonic landscapes, but then at the same time it's filled with like a sort of singer-songwriter quality that, like, I guess you'd see on, like, Roky Erickson's solo career later on. But, like, it's filled with interesting choices, like covering a Bob Dylan song for some reason.
Yeah,
It's a case of, which is a pretty, like, fairly covered song. That'd be one of the earliest covers of it. And it's very intuitive to, like, when I first heard that song, I thought it was a 13th Floor Elevator song. So it's kind of like the Bob Dylan cover song in a way. It's a bit better than Herman's Hermits. But yeah, and then there are just these moments of like hippie like balladeering on this album, and they're some of the best like ballad songs I think I've ever heard. They're honestly, I feel like they're drawn from this like psychedelic well of like collective unconscious universal experience. That are like these sort of like humanist platonic sort of chants at the same time as being tied into like a very primitive, like romantical sensibility.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the sort of sentiment that would only come out of that era. And well, any sort of psychedelic music actually sort of tries to encapsulate this. But it's a very rare case of it being done by a singer-songwriter. And, like, I just feel that, especially if you understand the sort of transitory experiences of psychedelic drugs, this album feels like and especially the lyrics are a sort of like atlas or like a roadmap that sort of lay forth an ethos more than a philosophy. It's an ethic and an idea of like how to, like you were almost describing about the Happy Mondays. I feel maybe even more so about like this album is sort of it's such a unique vision of how to balance a sort of healthy psyche done through such absurd, eccentric ways that I can't help but like feel that it permeates maybe that sort of like Terence McKenna-esque idea of novelty.
Yeah.
You know, when he would try to describe this idea of novelty, it sort of feels like where this album's coming from. And yeah, just all the songs are like, yeah, if you're ever so inclined, if you listen to this album whilst on any drug, it even sober, but more so on like any drug, you feel like it's a legitimate spiritual experience, honestly. I very rarely would advertise something as being a spiritual experience, but this album is one of them, honestly. And Chill Out too, probably, but definitely this album. Yeah, what do you reckon?
Yeah, East Everywhere. It's the how it would contrast with the self-titled, the psychedelic sounds of the 13th Floor Elevators. That's a more sonically dense and sort of raw soundy record. This one's more of about the production emanating from the songs, and you know, it's another great record. They would put out 2 more after this, something called Live and The Bull of the Woods. Neither are as interesting or creative, I think, as these first 2. Roky Erickson has some fascinating work in the early 80s, of course. Couple, the Evil One, and I can't remember what the other album's called, but they're both really cool. And but with this record, it's one of the more interesting and captivating and listenable of the American late 60s psych albums. You know, we can talk about United States of America or Surrealistic Pillow, you can throw Zappa in there. One really interesting one, which I'm sure we'll discuss one day, is Parable of Arable Land.
Yeah,
that's an experience for anyone. My goodness, man. And
yeah,
the East Everywhere, really great stuff. And I think I might prefer the first one, but this is also a really, really great. At one point I preferred East Everywhere, but then I came around to the first one actually. And then East Everywhere I still have a great soft spot for. Really great, re-listenable record. And you know what happened was, I was acquiring a copy of East Everywhere from the internet, and I realized I downloaded this copy that was in mono, and I thought, okay. And I thought, wait a minute. Well, you know what might be interesting?
It's 2 different versions, yeah.
I downloaded the stereo one as well, and I decided I would listen to mono and stereo back to back. And mono, it sounded great.
Yeah.
Straight punch, good, very nice, great psych rock and roll. And with stereo, I found it very, very tasteful. I remember I once heard John Lennon deride the title track of Sgt. Pepper's in stereo versus mono. He said the stereo sounded like a scoop full of ice cream. And this was a beautiful stereo mix, because what it did was it accentuated what was good about the mono mix. You understand? It was just elevating what was appealing about the mono mix. Maybe it's the speaker I was listening to, but...
Oh, especially with headphones, the stereo mix of this album.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's interesting you bring up the mono and stereo mix, because, I did neglect to mention, this album has 2 different... Yeah, it's a rare case of an album having a mono and a stereo mix, but...
Contemporary to its release.
And neither one is better than the other, definitively.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas most of the albums it did, either one or the other is the better version,
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, this album works in both mono and stereo in a different way.
Yeah.
That's definitely true, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great release, and Yeah, they had some of the greatest potential of any group, although kind of necessarily short-lived, you know what I mean? A bit like the Doors, or a bit like, Jefferson Airplane moved on,
Sure, yeah.
United States of America don't have another album. I don't think that sold much of the time.
Yeah.
Or since, really. You can't be too surprised at the outcome of that brief spasm of really cool sonic creativity in the United States and the UK as well, of course.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, this is one of the more like sort of on point American ones, I suppose. Like you were mentioning, the Parabola and Arable and Red Crayola. They're the other like Texan psychedelic group.
Sure,
that there was a real scene in Texas there, I think.
Nice, yeah.
Because those two collaborated. I'm pretty sure they appear on each other's albums and stuff like that.
Cool.
You know, they're from the same world, and yeah, I guess I can't sing the praises of this album enough. Like, I just feel like it's a sort of like, yeah, maybe it's exclusive to people who have had the experience of psychedelic drugs. Like maybe it doesn't appeal to people who don't. But I just feel so passionately, maybe because it's subjective, but it feels a bit more like perhaps Roki was like tapping into this sort of ethereal wisdom, as a guy who like was creative by nature. It seems not particularly wise. He wouldn't claim to be a sage or anything like that, and so through these like sort of like strange circumstances comes to this sort of implicit wisdom in the human condition, which maybe was, helped out by drug-induced experiences. But I feel regardless of that, this is the sort of album that, like, similar to the joke about if you put all the world leaders into a room and you gave them psychedelic drugs, we'd have world peace. Like, perhaps you don't even need the drugs, you just play this album at the UN and suddenly all conflicts are resolved.
Wow.
Maybe that's a bit simplistic, but maybe not. Maybe the simplicity is key there.
You know what the 13th floor elevators do that is really kind of really impressive and compelling, and it's the same thing that actually the Grateful Dead do, and they're more famous for it,
Sure.
of course. They make that counterculture seem very organically American to the point where it's like more the natural evolution of the American consciousness, or in a subculture at least, rather than this sort of, subversive abrasion, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I maybe because there's not so much an overtly political element in either band, like compared to, say, the Fugs, or who weren't necessarily a psych act as such, or
Sure.
Red Crayola, which is kind of more, I think they're more explicitly like kind of modernist, avant-garde beat.
And political,
Yeah. Or, of course, Zappa kind of was psyched to take the piss, but it's psychedelic music.
Yeah.
And he was more political than not as political as the Fugs in his own admission. But he was more political. Later on, he actually was quite political, but
a lot more political than the 13th floor elevators.
Yeah, exactly. And Airplane, or the Doors, or
But there is a
Dead.
certain, like I was mentioning, that ethos, and they emanate that ethos more so than maybe the more overtly political groups like the Fugs or Zappa or Red Crayola. And because it's more sort of implicit, maybe similar to the Grateful Dead, it's about the ethos and where it's coming from. It's not as much a polemic as it just is what it is,
Yeah.
It's the result. It's the symptom of the thing that those other more political artists are critiquing. Is Roky Erickson or is the 13th floor elevators,
Yeah, it's almost like their political angle is this American ideal, this romantic notion of freedom is the freedom from politics almost itself, in a way.
Sure.
Which is kind of, in an American kind of small government sense, is vaguely founding fathers-ish, you could argue. Maybe I'm overlooking something, but and that's what some people seem to point to as being, checks and balances, not having a large tyrannical omnipotent state, which seems kind of silly when you think of America now, but at one point,
Yeah, well, that's a whole weird debate whether the states' rights are constitutional or not. Because I think it seems to be that most intellectual constitutionalists consider states' rights to be a more of a later thing. That actually the Constitution grants the federal government, more authority than the states by nature of the Constitution.
Yeah.
Whereas like states' rights seems like a bit of a later invention to sort of maintain a monopoly on like one like more localized political theater.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how like I've seen a few things recently, like like a weird YouTube documentary about like these cattle farmers in like the mid 2010s. They're like cattle ranchers who use federal land to graze their cattle.
Mm-hmm.
And like, cause it was in Arizona or something where like most of Arizona is just desert and federal land.
Sure, yeah.
And so like up until the 90s or something, they're allowed to just graze on the land with like a permit or whatever. Or yeah, after the 90s they had to have a permit because like some turtle was going extinct, some desert turtle.
Mm-hmm.
And so this one rancher, and it happened I think in a few ranches, but this one specifically became like a big deal in the news over there because like there was a Waco, almost like Waco-esque like standoff with the federal authorities. And the guy who made this doco was like, he got on the inside and was interviewing the people behind it, like these sort of guys from back then, these ranchers and whatnot. And just their perspective of like social behavior and the law essentially as like a socially cohesive society was so like indebted with this like American exceptionalist like individual like property rights like antisocial philosophy that like they kept citing that the states' rights have like, you know, the feds can't come in here and take this, like the sheriff, the local authority, as the Constitution says, has the greatest right over the law. But apparently like every constitutionalist says that like the federal government obviously does, like this whole states' right or like local government authority thing is just completely like fabricated out of strange like isolationist narratives.
Yeah.
And so like I suppose a band like the 13th Floor Elevators or the Grateful Dead can sort of like capture that very like it makes sense to me that the Grateful Dead's fan base were all like conspiracy theorists and like cyberpunk sort of people in the 90s, right? Like one of the sound engineers for the Grateful Dead, I think his name's John Oswald. He put out all these like Sampledelia, Sound Collage, experimental plunderphonics albums. You know, he invented the term plunderphonic actually on an album. It was an album name.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, they were like intrinsically tied into that sort of things, that sort of cyberdelic world as well. And cyberdelia is like almost the digital equivalent of that like American thing, though I suppose because of like open sourcing and things like that, it is more social. It's not like property or whatever. But yeah, it's just weird that you can almost sympathize with these like crazy people who go on about like being able to use federal land to graze their cattle or whatever and start like civil unrest. Because it's interesting, these people eventually they try to create a movement of like a literal rebellion. It's almost like a proto January 6th type of thing, where they like try to go to some like town in Oregon, some rural town that had similar problems or whatever, and they took over like a federal like lake or whatever, the facilities there, and that's where they really started a Waco after like their first Waco sort of worked and the feds had to back off. And so it's just so weird that like there's like that sort of spirit of individualism and individual expression got like sort of warped into these like conspiratorial way, like sort of tendencies in the sort of the post-internet world, whereas the conspiratorial culture jammers prior to the internet were like the KLF and Negative Land. They like these sort of people were the opposite, right? It went from being a sort of this conspiratorial paranoid exercise was an exercise of left-wing rebellion to being an exercise of right-wing rebellion. It's strange how that, at least in America, sort of flipped, eh?
Yeah, that's how it certainly can come across. I agree. Yeah.
No, that's a bit of a tangent, but yeah, I guess like you were mentioning the Grateful Dead and the 13th Floor Elevators, they fit into that world where you can almost empathize with that hyper exceptionalist American condition. Like, you can almost pity it. Like, it's a shame they have to conform to such notions. Maybe that's why the music was really good.
Yeah, that's a great potentiality. Yeah, great music we have here in the first two 13th Floor Elevator records. A very fascinating epoch, recorded music in general. And that, I believe, concludes the 10 records for Mandala this week. Unless we've got anything else to share about the records or anything else in particular, I suppose.
Nah, except for maybe, in the sense of hippie, Happy Mondays, jam band music, the world needs less conformists like the Dave Matthews Band and more out there people like Roky Erickson.
Signing off.